In this video, we're going to be breaking down 13 horrifying child killer cases. Let's get started. Starting it off with the Moors murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, UK, 1963, 1965. The Moors murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, UK, 1963, 1965. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley murdered 5 children and teenagers in Manchester, England, burying most of their bodies on Saddleworth Moor. Their crimes became known as the Moors murders, and they remain 2 of the most notorious killers in British history. Ian Brady was born in Glasgow, Scotland, in January 1938. His mother was a 28-year-old waitress named Maggie Stewart, who felt unable to care for a child, so she left him with a local couple named John and Mary Sloan. The identity of his father remains uncertain, though his mother claimed he was a reporter who died before Ian was born. She visited him frequently at first, but as he grew older, her visits became less common. When Brady was 12, his mother moved to Manchester with her new husband, Patrick Brady. As a child, Brady displayed deeply disturbing behavior. He tortured and killed animals, once setting a dog on fire. He also began attacking other children. At Camden Street Primary School, teachers considered him an underachiever who kept to himself and showed little interest in forming friendships. Brady's behavior worsened as he entered his teenage years. He racked up a criminal record for burglaries and other petty crimes. Several arrests landed him first in juvenile detention and later in a local prison. When he was released, Brady took a job as a stock clerk at Millward's Merchandising, a chemical distribution company in Gorton, Manchester. His colleagues regarded him as quiet and punctual but noted his short temper. Brady spent his free time reading, and his interests were dark and disturbing. He owned books about Nazi Germany, including Mein Kampf, and read extensively about Nazi atrocities. He became fascinated with the life and works of the Marquis de Sade, the French author whose writings about torture and sadistic violence gave rise to the term sadism. Brady also rode a Tiger Cub motorcycle, which he used to visit the Pennines, the moorland areas outside Manchester. He began developing a philosophy that he was superior to others, and that conventional morality did not apply to him. Myra Hindley came from a very different background. She was born in Crumpsall, Manchester, on the 23rd of July, 1942, to parents Nellie and Bob Hindley. She was raised in Gorton, a working-class area dominated by Victorian slum housing. Her father was an alcoholic who frequently became violent toward his wife and children. The family home was in poor condition, and Hindley was forced to sleep in a single bed next to her parents' double bed because of the cramped living situation. Despite the difficulties at home, Hindley had a relatively normal childhood compared to Brady. She attended school regularly and had friends. However, tragedy struck when her close friend Michael Higgins drowned in 1957. Hindley partially blamed herself for his death because she had turned down the chance to join him at the reservoir that day. The guilt from this incident stayed with her. By the time she was 18, Hindley was working as a typist at Millward's Merchandising. In January 1961, Brady started working at the same company where Hindley was employed. She became instantly infatuated with him, even after learning he had a criminal record for burglaries. Hindley pursued Brady for months, but he initially ignored her advances. Eventually, he asked her out, and on their first date, he took her to see a film about the Nuremberg trials. This set the tone for their relationship. Brady shared his collection of Nazi literature with Hindley, and they began reading books about Nazi atrocities together during their lunch breaks. Brady introduced Hindley to his philosophical views about power, violence, and his belief that he was above conventional morality. Hindley transformed herself to fit what Brady wanted. She bleached her hair blonde and wore dark red lipstick to resemble the Aryan ideal promoted by Nazi ideology. She became completely devoted to Brady and adopted his worldview. The couple began discussing crimes they could commit together. At first, they talked about robberies that would make them rich, but Brady steered the conversations toward murder. He told Hindley that killing would be more satisfying than theft. He spoke about committing the perfect murder, one that would never be solved. Hindley agreed to help him. By mid-1963, Brady and Hindley had decided to act on their fantasies. They chose victims who would be easy to lure and who came from working-class families, believing these disappearances would receive less attention from police. They also selected Saddleworth Moor as their disposal site. The moor was a vast, desolate stretch of moorland covering about 24 square miles, with few visitors and countless places to hide a body. Brady was familiar with the area from his motorcycle trips. The couple developed a method that would prove devastatingly effective. Hindley would approach potential victims alone because a young woman seemed less threatening than a man. She would use simple ruses to gain their trust, often claiming she needed help finding a lost item or carrying packages. Brady would follow at a distance, either on his motorcycle or in a separate vehicle, ready to assist once the victim was isolated. On the 12th of July, 1963, 16-year-old Pauline Reed was walking to a dance near her home in Gorton. She was wearing her best clothes and looking forward to the evening. Myra Hindley pulled up beside her in a van. Pauline knew Hindley because Pauline was friends with Hindley's younger sister, Maureen. She trusted the older woman completely. Hindley told Pauline she had lost an expensive glove on Saddleworth Moor and asked if she would help search for it. She offered Pauline money for her time. Pauline agreed without hesitation and got into the van. Brady followed behind on his motorcycle. The drive to the moor took about 30 minutes. Once they arrived at the isolated moorland, Hindley led Pauline away from the road, pretending to search for the glove. When they were far enough from any potential witnesses, Brady emerged. He attacked Pauline, beating her in the face and knocking her to the ground. He raped her, then cut her throat twice, with such force that he nearly decapitated her. Some accounts suggest he also struck her in the head with a shovel. Pauline died on the cold moorland, far from the dance she had been excited to attend. Brady and Hindley buried her in a shallow grave, then drove back to Manchester as if nothing had happened. Pauline's family reported her missing immediately. The police investigated, but without witnesses or evidence, the case went cold. 4 months later, on the 23rd of November 1963, 12-year-old John Kilbride was at Ashton Market earning pocket money by helping vendors pack up their booths at the end of the day. Hindley approached him and asked if he could help carry some boxes to her car. She promised to pay him and give him a ride home afterward. John was a responsible boy trying to earn money to help his family, so he agreed. Hindley led him to her vehicle, and they drove towards Saddleworth Moor with Brady following nearby. Once on the moor, Hindley used the same missing glove story to lure John away from the road. Brady appeared and raped the 12-year-old boy. The exact method of John's murder remains disputed. Hindley claimed Brady tried to cut the boy's throat with a knife, but the blade was too dull, so he strangled him with a piece of string. Brady later claimed he strangled John with his bare hands. Either way, John Kilbride was murdered and buried in a shallow grave. His family launched a desperate search. Police conducted a massive investigation, taking over 700 statements and printing 500 missing posters. Despite the extensive effort, John was never found. 8 months passed before Brady and Hindley killed again. On the 16th of June, 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett was walking to his grandmother's house in the Longsight district of Manchester. It was a walk he had made many times before. Hindley approached him in her car and asked if he could help her load some boxes. She offered to drive him to his grandmother's house afterward. Keith agreed, likely thinking he was just helping a woman with her shopping. Hindley drove him to Saddleworth Moor, where Brady was waiting. Keith was raped and strangled, then buried somewhere on the vast moorland. The police investigation initially focused on Keith's stepfather as a suspect. Over the next 2 years, he was questioned 4 times. Police searched under the floorboards of the family home and extended the search to connected houses on the entire street, but they found nothing. Keith Bennett's body has never been found, and his burial location remains unknown to this day. 6 months later, on the 26th of December 1964, Boxing Day, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey went to a local fairground in Ancoats with a neighbor. Her mother, Ann West had initially said no because Leslie's older brother was home with the flu, but when the neighbor's family agreed to watch her, she relented. Leslie left the house wearing a blue coat and red shoes, excited for the fair. Brady and Hindley spotted Leslie at the fairground. They noticed she had become separated from her group. They approached her carrying shopping bags, then deliberately dropped some of the packages. They asked Leslie to help them carry the items to their car and then to their house. The 10-year-old girl agreed to help, but this time, instead of going to the moor, Brady and Hindley took Leslie directly to their home at Wardlebrook Avenue. What happened next represents some of the most disturbing evidence in British criminal history. Hindley had already dropped her grandmother off at a relative's house to ensure they would be alone. Brady had set up photographic equipment in the spare bedroom, including a camera, tripod, and lighting. They undressed Leslie, gagged her, and forced her to pose for pornographic photographs. The entire assault was recorded on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, capturing 16 minutes of audio. On the tape, Leslie can be heard begging for her life, crying for her mother, and screaming that she cannot breathe. Brady and Hindley's voices are clearly audible, threatening the child and telling her to be quiet. At one point, Leslie pleads that she needs to get home before 8 o'clock or she will get in trouble. The recording captures her saying, "It hurts me neck, and please let me go." The tape ends abruptly so Brady could plug in his photography lights. After the photographs were taken, Leslie was raped and murdered, either by strangulation or suffocation. Her body was then taken to Saddleworth Moor and buried. A massive search involving thousands of volunteers was launched, but Leslie was never found. Her stepfather became a suspect and endured repeated police questioning, but no evidence linked him to her disappearance. The murders continued until the 6th of October, 1965, when Brady and Hindley killed 17-year-old Edward Evans. Brady had seen Evans at a bar in Manchester and invited him back to their house for a drink. Evans accepted. What Brady had planned, though, was different from the previous murders. He wanted to recruit someone to help with future killings. Brady had been cultivating a friendship with David Smith, the 17-year-old husband of Hindley's younger sister, Maureen. Smith had 3 minor criminal convictions and had been in a brief relationship with Pauline Reed years earlier. Brady had been impressing Smith with stories about crime and philosophy, reading passages from the Marquis de Sade about murder being justified. On the night of October 6, Brady called Smith and asked him to come to the house to pick up some wine bottles. Smith agreed and arrived around midnight. When he knocked on the door, Brady let him in and told him to wait in the kitchen. Smith heard a loud scream, then Hindley shouting for him to help. He ran into the living room and saw Brady standing over Edward Evans with a hatchet. Brady was striking Evans repeatedly with the axe. Smith watched in horror as Brady hit Evans more than 14 times, then strangled him with an electrical cord to finish him off. Brady and Hindley were calm afterward, acting as if they had just completed a normal task. They cleaned up the blood, wrapped Evans' body in plastic, and sat down to have tea with Smith. Hindley made jokes about the killing. Brady talked about how they had killed before and buried bodies on the moor. Smith pretended to be impressed, terrified that he would be next if he showed any disapproval. He stayed for hours, waiting for a safe moment to leave. Finally, around 3 in the morning, Smith left the house. The moment David Smith got home, he woke up his wife Maureen and told her everything he had witnessed. Despite Maureen being Hindley's sister, they both agreed they had to go to the police. In the early morning of the 7th of October 1965, Smith called the police from a telephone box. He was shaking and struggling to explain what he had seen. Police arrived at Brady and Hindley's home later that morning. They found Edward Evans's body wrapped in plastic in the spare bedroom. They also found a left luggage ticket tucked into a prayer book. This ticket led them to Manchester Central Station, where they discovered 2 suitcases in a storage locker. Inside those suitcases, police found photographs of Leslie Ann Downey, naked, gagged, and posed in various positions. They found the 16-minute tape recording of her final moments. They found photographs of Brady and Hindley standing on Saddleworth Moor in locations that looked like burial sites. One photograph showed Hindley crouching down with her dog. appearing to look directly at the ground. Police realized they had uncovered evidence of multiple murders. Based on the photographs, police launched a massive search of Saddleworth Moor. On the 16th of October 1965, they found the body of Leslie Ann Downey in a shallow grave. Days later, on October 21, they found John Kilbride's body buried nearby. The photograph of Hindley with her dog had been taken directly above John's grave. Police had enough evidence to charge Brady and Hindley with the murders of Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. However, they found no evidence linking the couple to the disappearances of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. Those cases remained unsolved for the time being. The trial began on the 19th of April, 1966, at Chester Assizes. It lasted 14 days and became one of the most heavily publicized criminal trials in British history. The courtroom was specially prepared, with bulletproof glass surrounding the dock, because authorities feared someone might try to kill Brady and Hindley. National and international journalists booked up most of the city's hotel rooms. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse every day, with some people traveling for hours just to stand outside. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones, the highest law officer in Britain. His involvement signaled the gravity of the case. David Smith served as the chief prosecution witness. His testimony described in detail what he had seen on the night of Edward Evans' murder. Brady and Hindley's defense teams tried to discredit Smith, and it emerged during the trial that Smith had been paid by a newspaper for his story, which created controversy. Despite this, his testimony remained consistent with his initial police statements. The most devastating evidence came from the tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey. When it was played in court, even experienced detectives and journalists broke down in tears. The 16 minutes of audio forced everyone in the courtroom to confront the reality of what Brady and Hindley had done to a 10-year-old child. The photographs of Leslie were equally damning, showing her terror and the calculated cruelty of her killers. Brady testified for over 8 hours, and Hindley testified for 6 hours. Both pleaded not guilty to all charges. Brady admitted to striking Edward Evans with the axe but claimed someone else had finished the killing. He displayed what court observers described as calm, undisguised arrogance throughout his testimony, which alienated the jury. Hindley claimed she had no knowledge that the photographs taken on Saddleworth Moor were near burial sites. She tried to portray herself as a victim of Brady's manipulation, but the tape recording made it impossible to believe she had been an unwilling participant. On the 6th of May, 1966, after 14 days of trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Ian Brady was found guilty of murdering Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. Myra Hindley was found guilty of murdering Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey, and guilty of being an accessory to the murder of John Kilbride. The death penalty had been suspended in the United Kingdom just months earlier in 1965, so both received life sentences instead of execution. Justice Fenton Atkinson, the trial judge, described them as two sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. Brady received 3 concurrent life sentences, and Hindley received 2 concurrent life sentences, plus an additional sentence for the accessory charge. The conviction brought relief to the families of the 3 victims whose murders had been proven, but it also began decades of pain and controversy. David Smith became reviled by the people of Manchester. Many suspected he had been directly involved in the murders, despite his role in bringing the killers to justice. He and Maureen received hate mail, their home was vandalized, and during the trial, Maureen was attacked in an elevator while 8 months pregnant. The stigma followed Smith for the rest of his life. He was later imprisoned for stabbing a man in a pub brawl, an incident he said was provoked by constant public harassment about his connection to the case. He and Maureen eventually divorced. The trauma destroyed their marriage and separated their family. In 1985, 20 years after their conviction, Brady confessed to 2 additional murders, those of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. The investigation was reopened, and both Brady and Hindley were taken from prison to Saddleworth Moor to help searchers find the burial sites. On the 1st of July 1987, Pauline Reed's body was finally discovered. Her family had waited 24 years for answers. Keith Bennett's body, however, was never found despite extensive searches. His mother, Winnie Johnson, campaigned tirelessly until her death in 2012, begging Brady and Hindley to reveal where her son was buried. Brady refused to provide specific information, and many believe he withheld the location deliberately to maintain power and control, even from prison. Myra Hindley spent the rest of her life trying to secure her release. Beginning in the mid-1990s, she launched multiple appeals, claiming she had reformed and deserved parole. Her supporters argued that without Brady's influence, she would never have become a killer. Some believed she was being kept in prison to satisfy public anger rather than for legitimate reasons. However, the public and the legal system overwhelmingly rejected her appeals. The tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey made it impossible for people to view Hindley with any sympathy. Her role in the crimes also violated traditional ideas about women and motherhood, making her especially hated by the British public. Her mugshot, taken shortly after her arrest, became one of the most recognizable images in British crime history, often described as the face of pure evil. Hindley died in prison on the 15th of November, 2002, at the age of 60, from bronchial pneumonia. She never received parole. Ian Brady spent most of his incarceration in a psychiatric hospital rather than a regular prison. He showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to take satisfaction in the ongoing pain he caused. He went on hunger strike in 1999 and was tube-fed for the rest of his life. He wrote a book analyzing serial murder, which sparked outrage when it was published. Brady died on the 15th of May, 2017, at the age of 79, from chest and lung conditions. Even in death, he provided no closure to Keith Bennett's family about the location of the boy's remains. The Moors murders left a permanent scar on British society. The case changed how the public viewed violent crime and child safety. It led to increased awareness about the dangers children faced and sparked discussions about how communities protect their young people. The desolate image of Saddleworth Moor became synonymous with evil in British culture. The case has been referenced countless times in books, films, and television shows as the benchmark by which other acts of depravity are measured. To this day, Keith Bennett's family continues searching for his body, hoping for the closure that has been denied them for over 60 years. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Marc Dutroux, Belgium's Child Abductions and Murders, 1990 seconds. Marc Dutroux, Belgium's Child Abductions and Murders, 1990 seconds. Marc Dutroux terrorized Belgium during the 1990 seconds by abducting, torturing, and murdering young girls. His crimes shocked an entire nation and exposed serious failures in the Belgian criminal justice system. The case became one of the most disturbing in European history, leading to the largest peacetime protest Belgium had seen since World War II. Marc-Paul Alain Dutroux was born on the 6th of November 1956 in Ixelles, Brussels. He was the eldest of 5 children. His parents were both teachers, and his father, Victor Dutroux, worked in Burundi when Marc was young. The family lived in the Belgian Congo for part of Marc's early childhood. After Burundi gained independence in 1962, the family moved back to Belgium and settled in the village of Obai in Hainaut province. Dutroux later reported that both his mother and father abused him during his childhood, though the extent of this abuse remains unclear. As a young man, Dutroux trained as an electrician but struggled to maintain steady employment. He married and had children, but his personal life was chaotic. By the late 1970 seconds, Dutroux had already begun his criminal career. In 1979, he was convicted of theft, muggings, drug dealing, and working with stolen cars. Over the next few years, his crimes became more serious. In 1985, he received a 6-month suspended sentence for theft. In 1986, he was arrested again for theft, and this time received a prison sentence. But these early convictions were minor compared to what came next. In the mid-1980 seconds, Dutroux began abducting and raping young girls. Working with accomplices, including his first wife Michelle Martin and a man named Jean Van Petegem, Dutroux kidnapped at least 5 girls between 1985 and 1986. The victims ranged in age from 11 to 19. Dutroux would lure them into his vehicle, often using his white van to abduct them. He would take them to his properties, where he sexually assaulted them. Sometimes, he photographed or filmed the attacks. Some victims were released after the assaults, while others were held for longer periods. In 1989, Dutroux was finally arrested and charged with the abduction and rape of 5 young girls. He was convicted and sentenced to 13 years in prison. This should have been the end of his criminal career, but the Belgian justice system made a catastrophic decision. During the time Dutroux was serving his sentence, Justice Minister Melchior Wathelet allowed the early release of many of Belgium's sex offenders as part of a broader policy. Despite the serious nature of his crimes, Dutroux was released on parole in April 1992 after serving just 3 years for good behavior. The decision would prove to be a deadly mistake. Experts had warned that Dutroux was dangerous and likely to offend again, but their warnings were ignored. After his release from prison in 1992, Dutroux wasted no time returning to his criminal activities. Although he was an unemployed electrician receiving welfare from the state, he somehow managed to own 7 houses across Belgium. He financed his properties by trading stolen cars in Poland and Slovakia and engaging in other criminal enterprises. Most of his houses stood vacant, but Dutroux had darker plans for them. He began constructing a secret dungeon in the basement of his house in Marcinelle, a suburb of Charleroi. The dungeon was a tiny room, barely 3 feet wide, hidden behind a heavy shelf in the basement. It was soundproofed with concrete and designed to hold prisoners. Inside this hidden chamber, Dutroux installed a bed, chains, and minimal facilities. He built it with one purpose in mind: to hold young girls captive so he could repeatedly abuse them. On the 24th of June, 1995, Dutroux struck again. 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, were best friends living in Gras-Holon, a suburb of Liège in eastern Belgium. The 2 girls disappeared near their homes. Dutroux had abducted them, using promises or force to get them into his vehicle. He drove them to his house in Marcinelle and locked them in the secret dungeon he had built. The girls were imprisoned in the tiny, dark space, chained by their necks to prevent escape. Over the following months, they endured repeated sexual abuse. Dutroux would take them out of the dungeon to assault them, sometimes filming or photographing the attacks. In a particularly cruel act, he allowed the girls to write letters home, which he read but never sent. He also let them keep a diary. Posters with Julie and Melissa's faces appeared in windows across Belgium as their families desperately searched for them. A massive police investigation was launched, but despite numerous leads, the girls remained missing. 2 months after Julie and Melissa's abduction, Dutroux kidnapped 2 more victims. On the 23rd of August 1995, 17-year-old and Marcel and 19-year-old Yves J. Lambrechts were on vacation in Ostend, a seaside town in Belgium. The 2 teenagers disappeared without a trace. Dutroux, with the help of his accomplice Michel Lelièvre, had abducted them. He took them to his properties where he imprisoned them in another hidden location. The teenagers were drugged, sexually assaulted, and held captive for a period of time. Their families reported them missing, but again, police struggled to find any leads. What happened next would haunt Belgium forever. Dutroux decided to murder Anne and Yves J. in the most brutal way imaginable. He sedated them with drugs, wrapped their bodies in plastic while they were still alive, and buried them in the ground. The teenagers suffocated to death, buried alive in a shed owned by Dutroux's accomplice Bernard Weinstein. Meanwhile, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau remained imprisoned in the dungeon in Marcinelle. Then, in December 1995, Dutroux was arrested for an unrelated crime, car theft. He was sentenced to several months in prison. Before being taken into custody, Dutroux instructed his wife, Michelle Martin, to feed the 2 8-year-old girls locked in his basement. Martin knew the girls were there. She knew they were prisoners. But while Dutroux was in prison for nearly 4 months, Martin did not feed them. She later claimed she was too frightened of her husband to enter the dungeon. She said she stopped by the house to feed the dogs, but she left Julie and Melissa to starve. The two little girls died of starvation and dehydration sometime in March 1996, after spending months locked in the dark dungeon. Their bodies were later buried in the garden of another property Dutroux owned in Sars-la-Buissière. During this same period, police came devastatingly close to saving the girls. Following tips from multiple sources, including an informant and Dutroux's own mother, police visited Dutroux's house in Marcinelle twice in December 1995. On December 13 and again on December 19, police officer René Michaud searched the property. During the searches, police heard children's voices coming from somewhere in the house. Michaud later claimed he believed the voices were coming from outside, not from inside the basement. The police also found videotapes during their search, but never watched them. Had they viewed the tapes, they would have seen Dutroux constructing the secret dungeon. Detectives accepted Dutroux's explanation that the ongoing construction in his house was for a new drainage system, not for the hidden cells he had built. The police left without finding Julie and Melissa, who were likely still alive at that point, locked just feet away in the basement. This failure would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. After Dutroux was released from prison in early 1996, he continued his pattern of abduction. On the 28th of May, 1996, 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne was riding her bike to school in Caen, a town in southwestern Belgium. Dutroux abducted her and took her to his house in Marcinelle. He locked her in the same dungeon where Julie and Melissa had died. Sabine was chained by her neck and held prisoner for 80 days. During her captivity, Dutroux repeatedly raped her. He told her elaborate lies, claiming he had saved her from a dangerous criminal organization and that her parents did not want her back. Sabine kept a diary during her imprisonment, marking each day she was sexually assaulted. If the abuse hurt her badly, she would leave 2 X marks next to the day. The diary became crucial evidence when she was finally rescued. On the 9th of August 1996, Dutroux abducted his final victim, 14-year-old Laetitia Delhez, in Bertrix. He took her to the same dungeon where Sabine was being held, but this time, witnesses had seen the abduction. A woman noticed Laetitia being forced into a vehicle and reported it to police. She was able to provide a description of the van. Police began investigating vehicle owners who matched the description. Marc Dutroux's name appeared on the list. On the 13th of August 1996, police arrested Dutroux, along with his wife Michelle Martin and his accomplice Michel Lelièvre. During questioning, Dutroux initially resisted, but eventually he led police to his house in Marcinelle. On the 15th of August 1996, police discovered the hidden dungeon. Behind the heavy shelf in the basement, they found Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez alive, chained and terrified. The girls were rescued after their horrific ordeal. 2 days later, on August 17, Dutroux led police to his property in Sars-la-Buissière. There, they exhumed the bodies of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau from the garden. The girls had been dead for months, starved to death while Dutroux was in prison. Also found buried in the same location was the body of Bernard Weinstein, one of Dutroux's accomplices. Dutroux had drugged Weinstein and buried him alive, likely to prevent him from talking to police. On the 3rd of September 1996, police found the remains of Anne Marchal and Ifye Lambrex buried in Jumet. The discovery confirmed the worst fears about their fate. Police also found hundreds of pornographic videos at Dutroux's properties, including homemade films he had made of his assaults on victims. The public reaction to the case was immediate and explosive. As details emerged about the police failures, anger turned to rage. People learned that police had searched Dutroux's house and heard children's voices, but failed to investigate further. They learned that Dutroux's mother had warned authorities in 1995 that her son was holding girls captive. They learned that an informant had told police in 1993 that Dutroux had offered him money to kidnap girls, and again in 1995 that Dutroux was building dungeons. All of these warnings had been ignored or not properly investigated. The revelation that Dutroux had been released early from prison after serving only 3 years of a 13-year sentence for child rape caused particular outrage. On the 20th of October 1996, Belgium witnessed one of the largest demonstrations in its history. Between 300,000 and 400,000 people participated in the White March, walking silently through the streets of Brussels. They marched to honor the victims and to demand reform of Belgium's police and justice systems. For a country of about 10 million people at the time, having up to 400,000 protesters was extraordinary. The march represented the anger and pain of an entire nation. The case continued to generate controversy. In October 1996, Judge Jean-Marc Connerat, who had been leading the investigation, was removed from the case by the Belgian Supreme Court. The court ruled that Connerat lacked objectivity because he had attended a fundraising dinner for programs that helped search for missing children. His dismissal caused even more public anger, with many believing it was part of a cover-up. Dutroux himself claimed during his arrest that he was part of a larger criminal network involving wealthy and powerful people. He suggested he had been kidnapping girls to sell into prostitution rings that included government officials and police officers. Michel Nihal, a businessman who was arrested as one of Dutroux's accomplices, had connections to prominent people in Belgian society. These allegations led many to believe that authorities had protected Dutroux and that the investigation failures were not just incompetence, but deliberate obstruction. However, prosecutors stated they found no conclusive evidence of a larger organized ring involving high-ranking officials, though doubts and theories persisted. In 1998, Dutroux escaped from police custody for 3 hours while being allowed to examine files for his trial. He grabbed a police officer's gun and hijacked a car before being recaptured in a field. The escape led to the resignation of Belgium's justice and interior ministers, as well as the chief of state police. The case had now toppled multiple government officials. A parliamentary inquiry investigated the entire affair and found evidence of serious incompetence and possible corruption. More than a third of Belgians with the surname Dutroux applied to legally change their names between 1996 and 1998, wanting to distance themselves from any association with the killer. Dutroux's trial finally began on the 1st of March 2004, nearly 8 years after his arrest. The trial took place in Arlon and lasted several months. Up to 450 people were called to testify. Dutroux was tried for the murders of Anne Marchal, Yves J. Lambrex, and Bernard Weinstein, as well as a host of other crimes including kidnapping, attempted murder, rape, and auto theft. To protect the accused from potential violence, they sat in a glass cage during the trial. Michel Martin was tried as an accomplice, as were Michel Lelièvre and Michel Nihoul. One of the most powerful moments came when Sabine Dardenne confronted Dutroux in court. She described in detail what he had subjected her to during her 80 days of captivity. When she asked him why he had not killed her, Dutroux replied coldly that it had never been his intention to harm her and that he had saved her from a wicked leader of a criminal organization. His claims were met with disgust. During the testimony, the father of another victim, Paul Marchal, collapsed in the courtroom. On the 22nd of June 2004, Dutroux was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Michel Martin received a 30-year sentence for her role in the deaths of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, whom she had allowed to starve. Michel Lelièvre was sentenced to 25 years for his role in the kidnappings and sexual abuse. Michel Nihal was acquitted of kidnapping charges but convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 5 years. He died in 2019 at age 78. The Dutroux case fundamentally changed Belgium. The country completely reorganized its law enforcement agencies and reformed its justice system. New laws were passed to make it much harder for sex offenders to receive early parole. The case raised awareness across Europe about child abduction and sexual abuse, prompting changes in how missing children cases were handled. The trauma to the victims' families was immeasurable. Winnie Johnson, the mother of Keith Bennett in the Moors murders case, had campaigned for years for answers, but in Belgium, the families of Dutroux's victims faced their own ongoing pain. The body of Keith Bennett was never found in the Moors case, and similarly, questions remained about whether Dutroux had more victims who were never identified. Michelle Martin was controversially released on parole in August 2012 after serving 16 years of her 30-year sentence. The decision sparked protests, with many believing she deserved to remain in prison for allowing 2 little girls to starve to death. Michel Lelièvre was released in 2019 after serving 23 years. Marc Dutroux remains in prison serving a life sentence. In recent years, his lawyer has attempted to secure his release, arguing that Dutroux is no longer dangerous. In 2020, Dutroux withdrew a bid for parole after a psychiatric report concluded he remained a high risk to reoffend. He is now 68 years old and continues to be incarcerated. The Belgian government demolished the house in Marcinelle where the dungeon had been located, and in 2023, a memorial garden was opened in tribute to Dutroux's victims. The case remains the worst criminal scandal in Belgian history, a reminder of the evil that one person can inflict and the catastrophic consequences when systems fail to protect the innocent. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Robert Black UK child abductions and murders, 1,970 seconds, 1,990. Robert Black UK child abductions and murders, 1,970 seconds, 1,990. Robert Black was a Scottish serial killer who murdered at least 4 young girls between 1,981 and 1,986. His crimes terrorized communities across the United Kingdom and led to one of the largest manhunts in British history. Black used his job as a delivery driver to travel the country, abducting children from different locations and disposing of their bodies hundreds of miles away. His eventual capture in 1990 came only by chance when a witness saw him kidnapping another child. Robert Black was born on the 21st of April 1947 in Grangemouth, Scotland. His mother was Jessie Hunter Black, a factory worker who gave birth to Robert and refused to name his father on the birth certificate. Unable or unwilling to care for an infant, she put Robert up for adoption when he was just 6 months old. He was taken in by an older couple named Jack and Margaret Tulip, who lived in Kinlochleven in the West Highlands of Scotland. The Tulips were already in their 50s when they adopted Robert. When Black was 5 years old, Jack Tulip died. Black later claimed that Jack had frequently beaten him, though he said he had no clear memories of his adoptive father. Margaret Tulip found raising Robert alone to be difficult. She would lock him in the house as punishment for misbehavior or pull down his pants and spank him with a belt. Black suffered from nightmares as a child, including a recurring dream about a hairy monster in a cellar full of water. From a very young age, Black displayed disturbing behavior. Around age 8, he began what he later described as odd sexual experiments. His hygiene was poor, and he rarely bathed. At school, other children nicknamed him Smelly Robbie or Smelly Bobby because of his unwashed appearance. He was both a bully who attacked younger children and a victim who was picked on by others. When Black was around 11 years old, Margaret Tulip died. With both adoptive parents now dead, Black was placed back into the state welfare and foster care system. He moved to a children's home called Reading Children's Home in Falkirk. There, his poor hygiene continued to be a problem, and he remained isolated from other children. At age 12, Black and 2 other boys from the home attacked a young girl in a field. The 3 boys tried to sexually assault her but failed. None of the boys were charged with any crime. As punishment, authorities moved Black to another facility, the Red House Orphanage in Musselburgh. At this institution, Black was sexually abused by male staff members over a period of several years. This abuse, combined with his earlier trauma, shaped his development in deeply destructive ways. Despite his troubled childhood, Black showed some promise academically and was accepted to Musselburgh Grammar School, where he performed slightly above average in his studies. He was particularly interested in sports and harbored dreams of becoming a professional footballer. However, his poor eyesight ended those ambitions. During his time living near Musselburgh, Black would walk to the nearby coastal town of Portobello, where he worked as a lifeguard at the swimming pools. Later, he would return to this area to commit murder. When he reached working age, Black moved around different jobs and locations. He worked briefly as a delivery boy in Greenock, outside Glasgow, and later moved to Kinlochleven before eventually settling in London. While working delivery jobs, Black later admitted that he molested around 30 children during his rounds. His sexual fixation on children was already firmly established. By the 1972, Black was living in London and had become deeply involved in child pornography. He frequented bookshops that sold illegal material, including magazines with titles like Lollitots and Teenage Sex, as well as films from Denmark. He traveled to Copenhagen and later to Amsterdam, specifically to purchase hardcore child pornography, amassing a large collection. In 1976, Black secured a job that would enable his killing spree. He was hired as a driver for Poster Dispatch and Storage, a London-based company that delivered advertising posters to various depots across England and Scotland. The job required him to drive long distances throughout the United Kingdom, and he worked for the company for more than a decade. This position gave Black the perfect cover to commit his crimes. He drove a blue Ford Transit van with windows in the back that he covered with black curtains. The back of the van became his mobile torture chamber, where he kept various implements for restraining and abusing victims. He even kept a one-piece child suit in the van, sized for ages 8 to 10, suggesting he had fantasies about dressing his victims. Black's first confirmed murder occurred on the 12th of August, 1981. 9-year-old Jennifer Carty was cycling from her home in Ballinderry, County Antrim, Northern Ireland, to visit a friend. She never arrived. 6 days later, her body was found in a dam at McKee's Dam in the Hillsborough area. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her red bicycle was discovered hidden behind some hedges, not far from where she had been taken. The location of her body near a major road between Belfast and Dublin led police to suspect her killer had been traveling through the area. At the time, investigators had no suspects and no clear leads. The case went unsolved for 3 decades. Black had been working as a delivery driver and was traveling through Northern Ireland when he spotted Jennifer cycling alone. He abducted her, took her to a remote location where he sexually assaulted her, then strangled her before dumping her body in the dam. Nearly a year later, on the 30th of July 1982, Black killed again. 11-year-old Susan Maxwell lived in Cornhill on Tweed, on the English side of the border with Scotland. She had asked her mother, journalist Liz Maxwell, if she could bike to her friend Alison Rayburn's house in Coldstream, Scotland, just across the border, to play tennis. Her mother initially said no, but Susan went anyway. A local farmer gave her a lift into town, and the 2 girls played tennis for about an hour. They agreed to meet again a week later for a local festival. At around 4:15 inches the afternoon, Susan began walking home across the bridge over the River Tweed. Witnesses saw her crossing the bridge alone. Black was driving his delivery van through the area and spotted Susan walking by herself. He parked in an empty field just beyond the bridge and waited for her to approach. When she came close, he abducted her. Susan was bound, gagged, and sexually assaulted. Her body was found on the 12th of August, 1982, more than 2 weeks after her disappearance. She was discovered near a clump of bushes close to the A518 road in Staffordshire, over 250 miles from where she had been taken. She had been raped and strangled. On the 8th of July 1983, Black's third confirmed victim was 5-year-old Caroline Hogg. She was the youngest of his known victims. Caroline lived in Portobello, a coastal suburb of Edinburgh, the same area where Black had worked as a lifeguard during his teenage years. On the evening of July 8, Caroline had attended a friend's birthday party and was playing on the promenade near the fairground. Witnesses reported seeing a disheveled, balding man with thick spectacles following Caroline. Several people saw the man take Caroline by the hand and lead her away from the area. Black had approached the little girl, gained her trust, and walked her to his van. He then drove her away from Edinburgh. Caroline was sexually assaulted and murdered. Her body was found 10 days later, on the 18th of July 1983, in a ditch near the M1 motorway in Leicestershire, more than 300 miles from Portobello, The discovery sent shockwaves through Edinburgh. Police now had 2 murdered children, both found far from where they had been abducted, and both discovered near major roads in the Midlands. On the 26th of March 1986, Black killed his 4th confirmed victim. 10-year-old Sarah Harper left her home in Morley, near Leeds, to walk to a corner shop to buy bread. She never returned. Her family reported her missing immediately, and a massive search was launched. Sarah had been abducted by Black as she walked the short distance from her home. He sexually assaulted her violently, then drowned her. Her body was found in the River Trent near Nottingham on the 19th of April 1986, about 4 weeks after her disappearance. The location suggested she had been put into the river while still alive, near Junction 24 of the M1 motorway. By this point, police across the United Kingdom were trying desperately to find connections between these murders. All the victims were young girls. All had been abducted from public areas. All had been found far from where they were taken, near major roads in the Midlands. The bodies of Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper were all discovered within 26 miles of each other, despite being abducted from locations hundreds of miles apart. In January 1988, British investigators received help from the FBI, who provided a psychological profile of the killer. The profile described the offender as a white male, aged between 30 and 40, likely closer to 40. He would be a classic loner, unkempt in appearance, with less than 12 years of formal education. He probably lived alone in rented accommodation in a lower middle-class neighborhood. The profile stated that the motive for the killings was sexual and that the offender likely had a fixation with child pornography, retained souvenirs from his victims, and probably engaged in necrophilia with the bodies shortly after death. This profile was remarkably accurate, but investigators still struggled to identify a suspect. On the 28th of April 1988, Black attempted another abduction in Nottingham. 15-year-old Teresa Thornhill was walking home from a park in the Radford area when a blue van pulled up ahead of her. As she walked past, the driver leaned out and asked if she could fix engines. Teresa found the question strange and kept walking. The man jumped out of the van and tried to grab her, but Teresa fought back and managed to break free. She ran to safety and reported the incident to police. The information about this attempted abduction was not initially connected to the murder investigation because Teresa was older than the other victims. This failure to link the cases meant that crucial information about a blue transit van and an attempted kidnapping in the Midlands was not passed to the National Investigation Team. Black's crimes finally came to an end on the 14th of July 1990, purely by chance. That day, Black was driving through the village of Stow in the Scottish borders. David Herkes, a 53-year-old retired postmaster, was mowing his front lawn when he saw a blue transit van slow to a stop across the road. The driver got out, apparently to clean his windscreen. Herkes saw his 6-year-old neighbor, Mandy Wilson, walking down the street. Herkes bent down to clear grass from his lawnmower. When he looked up moments later, he saw the girl's feet lifting off the pavement. He straightened up and saw the driver of the van hastily pushing something through the passenger door before climbing across to the driver's seat. The van sped away. Realizing he had just witnessed an abduction, Herkes immediately noted the registration number of the van. He ran to Mandy's house, and her mother called the police. Within minutes, police were at the scene. By extraordinary luck, a patrol car was already in the area. Officers began searching for the van. The van had driven out of sight, but Black had turned around and was driving back through the village. When police saw the van returning, one officer jumped into its path, forcing Black to stop. Robert Black was pulled from the vehicle and arrested. One of the officers opened the back of the van and found Mandy Wilson inside a sleeping bag with her head covered. She was bound and gagged with tape, barely able to breathe. In a shocking twist, the officer who rescued her was Police Constable Wilson, Mandy's own father. He shouted at Black that the child was his daughter. Medical examination found that Mandy had already been sexually assaulted. Doctors testified that if she had remained in the sleeping bag with her mouth taped shut, she would likely have died within 15 minutes from suffocation. Police searched the van and found what they described as a torture kit. Inside were ropes, gags, tape, sleeping bags, and other implements for restraining and abusing children. On the 10th of August 1990, Black was tried at Edinburgh High Court for the abduction and sexual assault of Mandy Wilson. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, Black pleaded guilty to all charges. His defense lawyer tried to argue that the abduction had been unplanned, a spontaneous act, and that Black had intended to release the girl after assaulting her. The prosecution countered that the equipment found in the van proved clear premeditation. Lord Donald MacArthur Ross sentenced Black to life imprisonment, describing it as a horrific and appalling case. He praised David Herkes, whose vigilance had led to Black's arrest and undoubtedly saved Mandy's life. Black initially announced his intention to appeal the sentence, but later abandoned this plan. Following Black's conviction for the Stowe abduction, Detective Hector Clark of Lothian and Borders Police began investigating whether Black might be responsible for the unsolved child murders. Clark oversaw a painstaking investigation that involved coordinating 5 different police forces across the United Kingdom. Investigators examined Black's work records, delivery schedules, and petrol receipts from his employer. They found that Black had been in or near the areas where Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper had disappeared on the dates of their abductions. They also discovered that Black's delivery routes had taken him to the locations where the bodies were found. The amount of evidence was staggering. Police had to use lorries to transport 22 tons of documentation to court. Although there was no forensic evidence directly linking Black to the murders, the circumstantial evidence was compelling. Black had opportunity, means, and motive for all 3 killings. His vehicle matched witness descriptions, his routes matched the crime locations, and the timing aligned perfectly. Black was charged with the murders of Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper, as well as the attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill in Nottingham. His trial began on the 9th of May 1994 at Newcastle Crown Court. The trial lasted several weeks. Black's defense lawyer, Ronald Thwaites, argued that police had seized on Black as a scapegoat after 8 years of unsuccessful investigation. He pointed out that while the evidence proved Black was a pedophile, it did not definitively prove he had progressed from molester to murderer. However, the prosecution presented the mountain of circumstantial evidence showing Black had been in the right place at the right time for all 3 murders. On the 19th of May 1994, Black was found guilty of murdering Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper, and of attempting to abduct Teresa Thornhill. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 35 years. The judge described him as one of the most dangerous men alive. In 2011, advances in forensic investigation and renewed examination of cold cases led police in Northern Ireland to charge Black with the 1,981 murder of Jennifer Cardy. Black was tried and convicted on the 27th of October 2011. This brought his total number of confirmed murders to 4. At the time of his conviction, Black was already serving multiple life sentences and would never be released from prison. Throughout his time in custody, Black refused to cooperate with investigators seeking information about other possible victims. Police believed he was responsible for many more murders than those for which he was convicted. He was suspected in the 1978 disappearance of 13-year-old Jeanette Tate, who vanished while delivering newspapers in Devon. At the time of Black's death, police were just weeks away from charging him with that murder. Black's name has also been linked to 4 murders in France and 5 in the Netherlands, as his delivery work sometimes took him to continental Europe. Police in Ireland suspected him in additional cases there as well. Robert Black died on the 12th of January 2016 at HM Prison Maghaberry in Northern Ireland. He was 68 years old and died of a heart attack. He had been serving 12 life sentences. His death meant that families of potential victims would never get answers about their missing children. Ray Wire, a sex crimes expert who interviewed Black extensively for a book, stated that Black had hinted at having other victims. Wire described Black as one of the worst sex offenders he had ever assessed. A forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Black in prison reported that Black compared his crimes to a theater performance and viewed himself as the unfortunate victim of life rather than taking responsibility for what he had done. Black maintained to the end that the Stowe abduction was his only crime, a claim that was proven false by his convictions. The case led to significant changes in how police forces across the United Kingdom coordinated investigations of child abductions and murders. The fact that information about Teresa Thornhill's attempted abduction had not been shared with the National Investigation Team highlighted serious flaws in communication between different police departments. David Herkes, the retired postmaster whose quick thinking led to Black's capture, received awards from Lothian and Borders Police and the Police Federation for his actions. He died in 2012 at age 75, having saved at least one life and ended the career of one of Britain's most prolific child killers. Robert Black's crimes remain a reminder of how one person with the right circumstances, a suitable job allowing him to travel, and a complete lack of conscience can terrorize an entire nation for years before being stopped by nothing more than chance. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Tsutomu Miyazaki, Japan's otaku killer of children, 1988, 1989. Tsutomu Miyazaki, Japan's otaku killer of children, 1988, 1989. Tsutomu Miyazaki terrorized Japan between 1988 and 1989 by murdering 4 young girls aged between 4 and 7 years old. His crimes shocked a nation that had experienced few violent crimes against children. Miyazaki abducted his victims, murdered them, then engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism with their bodies. He also taunted the families of his victims with disturbing letters and phone calls. When police finally caught him, they discovered a massive collection of violent videos and anime that led Japanese media to dub him the otaku murderer. His case sparked a moral panic about the influence of violent media and changed how Japanese society viewed isolated young men obsessed with anime and horror content. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on the 21st of August 1962 in Itsukaichi, Tokyo, Japan. He was the eldest of 4 siblings and grew up in a wealthy and influential family. His father owned a local newspaper. However, Miyazaki's early life was marked by significant problems. He was born prematurely, which resulted in a severe physical deformity. His hands were fused directly to his wrists, meaning he had to move his entire forearm in order to rotate his hands. This condition made even simple tasks difficult and caused him embarrassment throughout his life. The deformity made Miyazaki a target for bullying when he started school. At Itsukaichi Elementary School, other children ostracized him because of his appearance. They gave him cruel nicknames and avoided him. As a result, Miyazaki became extremely isolated and kept to himself. He had few friends and spent most of his time alone. During his trial, facts about his parentage emerged. It was revealed that Miyazaki was the result of an incestuous relationship between his father and his father's sister. This information added another layer of tragedy to his troubled background. At home, Miyazaki's relationship with his family was poor. His parents were busy with work and did not spend much time with him. He felt rejected by his 2 younger sisters. The only family member who showed him affection and support was his grandfather, with whom he was very close. Despite his social difficulties, Miyazaki performed well academically during his early school years. He was initially one of the best students in his high school class. He had dreams of becoming an English teacher. However, as he grew older, his grades began to drop significantly. When it came time to apply for university, Miyazaki failed to gain admission to Meiji University, a prestigious private university in Tokyo. This failure crushed him. Instead of attending the university he wanted, Miyazaki enrolled in a junior college, where he studied to become a photo technician, abandoning his ambitions of becoming a teacher. After completing his studies, Miyazaki moved back into his parents' house in Itsukaichi. He shared a room with his older sister. Although his family was highly influential in the town, Miyazaki expressed no interest in taking over the family business. He felt his parents cared more about material success than his emotional well-being. Later, he would say that what he really craved was someone to listen to his problems. but he believed his parents would have ignored him. By this time, Miyazaki had become deeply depressed and began considering suicide. He felt completely isolated from the world around him. His only source of comfort was his grandfather, but in May 1988, his grandfather died. This loss devastated Miyazaki. In an attempt to retain something from his grandfather, he ate part of his grandfather's ashes. The death deepened his depression and pushed him further into isolation. A few weeks after his grandfather's death, one of Miyazaki's sisters caught him watching her while she was taking a shower. When she confronted him and told him to leave, Miyazaki attacked her. When his mother learned about the incident and demanded that he spend more time working and less time watching videos, he attacked her as well. By this point, Miyazaki had amassed a massive collection of materials. He owned over 5,700 videotapes, including anime, horror films, slasher movies, adult pornography, and child pornography. He spent most of his time alone in his room watching these videos. According to a high school classmate, Miyazaki had an inferiority complex and would not interact with older women. He would attend college tennis matches solely to photograph female players, then use the photos to masturbate. His social isolation was complete. He had no friends, no romantic relationships, and no meaningful connections to anyone except through his obsessive consumption of media. On the 22nd of August 1988, one day after his 26th birthday, Miyazaki committed his first murder. 4-year-old Mari Kono was playing at a friend's house when Miyazaki approached her. He led the little girl into his black Nissan Langley. He drove westward from Tokyo and parked the car under a bridge in a wooded area. There, he sat alongside Mari for about half an hour before murdering her by strangulation. After she was dead, he sexually molested her corpse. He took photographs of her body and took her clothes home as souvenirs. He left her body in the hills. A few days later, Miyazaki returned to where he had left Mari's body. He cut off her hands and feet and took them home with him, keeping them in his closet as trophies. After the body had decomposed further, he burned the bones and ground them into powder. He then sent some of the powdered bones to Mari's family in a box, along with a note that read in Japanese characters, meaning, Mari, bones, cremated, investigate, prove. The family was horrified to receive the remains of their daughter in this manner. On the 3rd of October 1988, Miyazaki killed his second victim. 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa was walking along a road when Miyazaki picked her up in his car. He took her to the same area where he had killed Mari Kono. He strangled Masami and then sexually assaulted her corpse. He left her body in the hills, just a few yards away from where he had left Mari. Police began investigating the disappearance of both girls, but they had few leads. The crimes shocked the local community in Saitama Prefecture, which had experienced very few violent crimes against children. On the 12th of December 1988, Miyazaki abducted his third victim. 4-year-old Erika Namba was returning home from a friend's house when Miyazaki forced her into his car. He drove to a parking lot in Naguri, Saitama. In the back seat of his car, he forced Erika to remove her clothes and began taking photographs of her. After he killed her, he tied her hands and feet behind her back, covered her body with a bedsheet, and placed her in the trunk of his car. He disposed of her clothes in a wooded area, but left her body in the adjoining parking lot. Her body was discovered 3 days later. On December 20, Erika's family received a postcard. The message had been assembled using words cut out from magazines. It read in Japanese, Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death. The cryptic message terrified the family and demonstrated the killer's desire to torment them even after their daughter's death. On the 6th of June 1989, Miyazaki murdered his fourth and final victim. He convinced 5-year-old Ayako Nomoto to allow him to take pictures of her. After gaining her trust, he led her into his car and murdered her by strangulation. He then took her body back to his apartment. For 2 days, he kept Ayako's corpse in his room and engaged in necrophilia, taking pictures and video footage of the body in various positions. When the body began to decompose, Miyazaki dismembered it. He disposed of the torso in a cemetery and the head in nearby hills. However, He kept Ayako's hands with him in his closet. In what became the most disturbing detail of his crimes, Miyazaki drank blood from Ayako's hands and ate parts of them, engaging in acts of cannibalism. Throughout this period, police struggled to find connections between the murders. The families of the victims had something in common beyond the tragic loss of their children. All of them received silent phone calls. The phones would ring for at least 20 minutes if no one answered. When someone picked up, there would be silence on the other end. Police suspected the same person was responsible for the calls and the murders, but they had no idea who the killer was or when he might strike again. On the 23rd of July 1989, Miyazaki's crimes came to an end through sheer chance. He was in a park in Hachioji when he saw two young sisters playing. He managed to separate the younger sister from the older one. He convinced the younger girl to take off her clothes and began taking photographs of her. He was attempting to insert a camera lens into the girl's vagina when the girl's father discovered what was happening. The father attacked Miyazaki and tried to restrain him, but Miyazaki broke free and fled on foot. He was naked as he ran from the park. However, Miyazaki needed to retrieve his car, which was still parked at the park. After some time had passed, he returned to get his vehicle. The father had already called police, and officers were waiting when Miyazaki came back for his car. He was arrested on the spot. Police searched Miyazaki's two-room bungalow and made shocking discoveries. They found 5,763 videotapes. The collection included anime, slasher films, horror movies, adult pornography, and child pornography. Interspersed among these commercially produced videos, police found footage and photographs that Miyazaki had created himself. These showed his victims. The images and videos documented his crimes in horrifying detail. Police also found body parts in his closet, including the hands of his victims that he had kept as trophies. When officers began cataloging everything in Miyazaki's apartment, several experienced investigators suffered symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder from exposure to the materials. The Japanese media quickly latched onto the story. They dubbed Miyazaki the otaku murderer, using a term that referred to people who were obsessively interested in anime, manga, and similar subcultures. The case caused a moral panic throughout Japan about the influence of violent media on young people and the dangers posed by socially isolated individuals who spent excessive time consuming such content. Miyazaki's trial began in 1990 and lasted for several years. Throughout the proceedings, Miyazaki showed no remorse whatsoever for his crimes. Instead of taking responsibility, he blamed his actions on an alter ego he called Ratman. He claimed this entity inside him had forced him to commit the murders. During court appearances, Miyazaki engaged in bizarre behavior. He attempted to transform himself into characters from comic books. He talked nonsensically and grinned and chuckled at inappropriate times. His behavior infuriated the families of his victims and shocked the Japanese public. Rather than showing any understanding of the pain he had caused, Miyazaki actually justified his killings by calling them acts of benevolence. He claimed the little girls had insulted him or talked back to him, and this was why he murdered them. He described his serial murders as acts of kindness. Miyazaki appeared completely indifferent to his capture and maintained a calm, collected demeanor throughout his trial. He seemed to feel proud of what he had done rather than ashamed. The defense team attempted to argue that Miyazaki was insane at the time of the crimes and therefore not responsible for his actions. Multiple psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Doctors diagnosed Miyazaki with one or more personality disorders. However, they ultimately determined that he was mentally competent and fully aware of his actions and their consequences at the time he committed the murders. The court ruled that while Miyazaki had severe character disorders, he had been completely sane when he killed the 4 girls. He was capable of understanding right from wrong and was therefore accountable for his crimes. The evidence against Miyazaki was overwhelming. DNA samples from his car and personal belongings matched DNA found at the crime scenes. Fiber analysis showed that fibers found on the victims' bodies and clothing matched fibers from Miyazaki's car and home. Police had eyewitness testimony from the father who caught Miyazaki in the act. They had Miyazaki's own confession, in which he revealed details only the killer could have known. They had the photographs and videos he had created. They had the body parts he had kept as trophies. The jury found Miyazaki guilty on all counts. On the 14th of April 1997, Tokyo District Court sentenced Miyazaki to death. His father was so ashamed of his son's actions that he refused to pay for his legal defense. In 1994, Miyazaki's father committed suicide, unable to live with the dishonor his son had brought upon the family. Miyazaki appealed his death sentence. The Tokyo High Court upheld the sentence in June 1997. He appealed again to the Supreme Court of Japan. On the 17th of January 2006, the Supreme Court rejected his final appeal and confirmed the death sentence. The legal process had taken 16 years from his arrest to the finalization of his death sentence. On the 17th of June 2008, Justice Minister Kunio Hatoyama signed Miyazaki's death warrant. That same day, Miyazaki was executed by hanging at the Tokyo Detention House. He was 45 years old. He was executed alongside 2 other convicted murderers. Miyazaki had spent 20 years on death row. Right up until his execution, he never apologized to the families of his victims. He never expressed genuine remorse for his actions or attempted to explain in any meaningful way why he had done what he did. During his time awaiting execution, another child killer in Japan, Kaoru Kobayashi, claimed he wanted to be the next Tsutomu Miyazaki. When Miyazaki heard about this, he stated that he would not allow Kobayashi to call himself the second Tsutomu Miyazaki when Kobayashi had not even undergone a psychiatric examination. Even facing death, Miyazaki remained arrogant and unrepentant. The timing and speed of Miyazaki's execution raised questions in Japan. The execution came shortly after the Akihabara massacre, another high-profile violent crime, and some observers wondered if the Justice Ministry was trying to send a message. However, the Ministry of Justice offered no comment on the timing. The case of Tsutomu Miyazaki had a profound and lasting impact on Japanese society. The murders themselves were horrifying enough, but the way Miyazaki tormented the families of his victims made the crimes even more unbearable. The discovery of his massive collection of violent and pornographic materials led to widespread debate about the effects of media on behavior. The term otaku, which had previously been used neutrally to describe fans of anime and manga, became stigmatized. The case contributed to negative stereotypes about socially isolated young men who spent excessive time consuming media. Many people unfairly blamed anime and horror films for creating a murderer, though experts pointed out that millions of people consumed similar media without becoming violent. The case also highlighted the phenomenon of hikikomori, individuals who withdraw completely from social life, often leading to severe psychological issues. It brought increased attention to the importance of mental health services and early intervention for troubled individuals. The families of Miyazaki's victims suffered immeasurable pain. Not only did they lose their young daughters to brutal murders, but they were also subjected to Miyazaki's taunting postcards, silent phone calls, and in Mari Kano's case, the horrific delivery of their child's cremated remains. The trauma inflicted on these families extended far beyond the initial loss. Tsutomu Miyazaki remains one of the most notorious serial killers in Japanese history, a reminder of how isolation, mental illness, and a lack of intervention can combine with individual evil to produce devastating consequences. His crimes changed Japanese society's conversation about child safety, media consumption, and the treatment of socially isolated individuals. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Mary Bell child killer at age 1 UK, 1968. Mary Bell child killer at age 1 UK, 1968. Mary Flora Bell was born on the 26th of May 1957 in Newcastle upon Tyne, England. She came into the world in one of the most deprived areas of the city, a place called Scotswood. This neighborhood sat in the west end of Newcastle, filled with crumbling houses and abandoned buildings where children played among broken concrete and rusted metal. The area had been hit hard by poverty, and families struggled to survive in conditions that would shock most people today. Mary's mother was Betty McCricket, who worked as a prostitute and was only 17 years old when she gave birth. Betty was an alcoholic with serious mental health problems, and she made no secret of the fact that she never wanted Mary. When nurses at the hospital tried to hand the newborn baby to her mother for the first time, Betty refused and said, "Take the thing away from me." The identity of Mary's biological father remains unknown to this day. For most of her life, Mary believed her father was William Bell, a violent alcoholic and career criminal with arrests for armed robbery. But William only married Betty after Mary was born, so nobody knows for certain if he was actually her biological father. Mary's childhood was a nightmare. Her family members later reported that Betty either deliberately neglected Mary or actively tried to kill her on multiple occasions. When Mary was around 3 years old, Betty dropped her from a first-floor window. Another time, she fed Mary a large amount of sleeping pills. In one particularly disturbing incident, Betty actually sold Mary to a mentally unstable woman who desperately wanted children but could not have any of her own. Mary's older sister, Catherine, had to travel alone across Newcastle to find Mary and bring her back home. Despite witnessing this abuse, and despite repeated offers from relatives to take custody of Mary, Betty refused to let anyone else raise her daughter. The abuse went even darker than neglect and physical harm. Later testimony and investigations revealed that Betty, who worked as a dominatrix, allowed her clients to sexually abuse Mary during sadomasochistic sessions starting in the mid-1960 seconds. Betty reportedly participated in several of these sessions herself, blindfolding Mary, restraining her hands behind her back, and forcing the young girl to perform sex acts on adult men. Some family members suspected that Betty suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychiatric condition where a caregiver deliberately harms someone in their care or fabricates health problems. At home and at school, Mary showed clear signs of severe psychological disturbance. She had sudden mood swings and wet the bed constantly. She fought with other children frequently and had attempted to strangle or suffocate peers on several occasions. In one incident, she tried to block a young girl's airway by stuffing sand in her mouth. Other children became afraid of Mary and avoided playing with her, but no authority figure intervened in any meaningful way, and Mary's violent behavior continued to escalate. The warning signs became impossible to ignore in the weeks before the first murder. On the 11th of May, 1968, Mary was playing with a 3-year-old boy when he fell from the top of an air raid shelter and was badly injured. His parents thought it was an accident. The very next day, 3 separate mothers came forward to police saying that Mary had tried to choke their young daughters. The police interviewed Mary, gave her a lecture, and sent her home. No charges were filed. No social services were contacted. Nobody took any real action. 2 weeks later, on the 25th of May, 1968, the day before Mary's 11th birthday, 4-year-old Martin Brown left his house to play. Martin was a happy little boy with dark hair who lived in the same Scotswood neighborhood as Mary. That afternoon, Mary strangled Martin to death inside an abandoned house at 85 St. Margaret's Road. She left the scene but returned later with her friend Norma Bell, who was 13 years old and not related to Mary despite sharing the same last name. When the 2 girls arrived at the abandoned house, they found that 2 local boys had already discovered Martin's body while playing and had run to get help. Martin was rushed to the hospital, but doctors pronounced him dead on arrival. The pathologist who examined Martin's body could not determine a definite cause of death. Although Mary had strangled him, her grip had not been strong enough to leave visible marks on his neck. The death was recorded as an open verdict, with authorities believing it was likely a tragic accident. Nobody suspected murder. 2 days after Martin's death, on May 27, vandals broke into a nearby nursery school. The police arrived to find the place had been torn apart. Among the chaos, they discovered several handwritten notes in childish writing. One note said, "I murder so that I may come back." Another read, "We did murder Martin Brown, fuck off you bastard." A third simply said, "Fooch off, we murder." "Watch out, Fanny and faggot." The most complex note read, "You are mice we becurse, we murdered Martain. Go brown you bete, look out there are murders about by Fanny and Ald faggot you screws." The police looked at these disturbing notes and dismissed them as a tasteless prank by children. They did not connect them to Martin Brown's death, which they still believed was an accident. On May 29, just before Martin Brown's funeral, Mary and Norma went to Martin's house and knocked on the door. When Martin's mother, June, answered, the girls asked to see Martin. June told them that Martin was dead and they could not see him. Mary replied, "Oh, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." June Brown closed the door, disturbed by the strange request, but not yet understanding its true significance. On the afternoon of the 31st of July, 1968, exactly 2 months after Martin's murder, 3-year-old Brian Howe was playing outside his house with one of his siblings and the family dog. Brian was a small boy with fair hair who usually stayed close to home. Mary Bell and Norma Bell were also playing in the street that day. At some point, Brian wandered off with the 2 girls. When Brian did not come home later that afternoon, his family became worried and began searching the neighborhood. Brian's older sister, Pat, went out looking for her little brother. She ran into Mary and Norma, who eagerly offered to help search for Brian. The 3 of them walked through the neighborhood together, with Mary and Norma leading Pat to different locations. They crossed the railroad tracks to reach the industrial area, a place local children called Tin Lizzie, where kids often played among construction materials, old cars, and dangerous wreckage. Pat was already frightened because she remembered that Martin Brown had been found dead just weeks earlier in a condemned house. Mary pointed toward some large concrete blocks and suggested, "He might be playing behind the blocks, or between them." Norma quickly said, "Oh no, he never goes there." Pat decided to leave that area and continue searching elsewhere. Mary and Norma knew exactly where Brian was because they had just killed him. According to Norma's later confession, Mary had told Brian that he had a sore throat and offered to massage it. She then tightened her grip around his neck and strangled him to death. At 11:10 that night, a search party discovered Brian's body lying between 2 large concrete blocks. Someone had made a weak attempt to hide the body by covering it with grass and weeds. Brian had been strangled to death. Near his body, police found a pair of broken scissors lying in the grass. The investigation revealed horrifying details. Brian's hair had been cut off in several places, with clumps scattered around the area. There were puncture wounds on his thighs. His genitals had been partially skinned with scissors or a razor blade. An inspector later described the scene as having a terrible playfulness about it, a terrible gentleness if you like, and somehow the playfulness of it made it more, rather than less, terrifying. Most disturbing of all, someone had carved the letter M into Brian's stomach using a razor blade. This cut was so light that it did not become visible until days later, after Brian's blood had cooled. Police reports later revealed that Mary had actually returned to Brian's body after killing him to carve this letter. She had first carved an N, then changed it to an M using a different hand. The neighborhood erupted in panic. 2 small boys were now dead within 2 months of each other. The police launched a major investigation, interviewing all the children in the area. Brian Howe's funeral took place on the 7th of August, 1968, with over 200 people attending. As Brian's small coffin was carried from his house, Mary Bell stood outside watching. She was laughing and rubbing her hands together. Detective Chief Inspector James Dobson, who witnessed this behavior, later said, "She stood there, laughing, and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one." During police interviews, Mary and Norma gave vague and conflicting answers about their movements on July 31. When pressed for more details, Mary began remembering things she claimed she had forgotten before. She described details about Brian's death that had not been made public and that only the killer could have known. At one point, Mary said she had seen Brian playing with an 8-year-old boy in the area where the accident happened. She mentioned that this boy had scissors with him. The police quickly checked this alibi and discovered that the boy Mary named had been at Newcastle International Airport on the afternoon of July 31 with multiple witnesses confirming this fact. Mary also described the scissors as broken or bent, a detail that only the killer would know since the police had not released this information. On the afternoon of August 4, Norma's parents contacted police and said their daughter wanted to confess what she knew about Brian Howe's death. Norma gave a full statement, admitting that Mary had strangled Brian while she watched. She described how Mary had told Brian to lift up his neck, and how Mary had threatened some boys who were nearby by saying she would set the dog on them if they came closer. Mary was visited at her home in the early hours of August 5. When confronted with the inconsistencies in her previous statements, Mary became defensive and said, "You're trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this." Later that same day, Norma was questioned again and provided even more details. Both girls were formally charged with the murder of Brian Howe at 8 p.m. on August 7. When told she was being charged with murder, Mary replied calmly, "That's all right by me." Norma burst into tears and shouted, "I never. I'll pay you back for this." The trial of Mary Bell and Norma Bell began at Newcastle Assizes on the 5th of December 1968. Both girls pleaded not guilty. Mary was defended by Harvey Robson, while Norma was represented by R.P. Smith. On the first day of the trial, the judge made a controversial decision to waive the defendants' right to anonymity because of their age. This meant the media could publish the names, ages, and photographs of both girls. Mary and Norma sat in the center of the courtroom alongside plain-clothed female police officers within arm's reach of their families throughout the entire trial. The prosecutor, Rudolph Lyons, opened the case with a 6-hour statement. He told the jury they faced an unhappy and distressing task because of the nature of the murders and the young ages of the defendants. Over 9 days, the court heard testimony from both girls, who blamed each other for the killings. The prosecution told the court that whoever murdered Brian Howe also murdered Martin Brown. Handwriting experts testified about the confessional notes found at the nursery, linking them to both girls. The court heard about Mary's morbid questioning of the victims' families and her requests to see the dead bodies. A child psychiatrist named Ian Fraser testified that although Mary's capacity to know right from wrong was limited by her age, she was still capable of understanding that what she had done was wrong. The trial also shed light on Mary's troubled upbringing. Norma's mother, Catherine, testified that months before Brian Howe's murder, she had discovered Mary attempting to strangle Norma's younger sister, Susan. Catherine said she had only managed to stop Mary when her husband punched the girl. On the 17th of December, 1968, the jury reached its verdict. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. Mary Bell was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility for both murders. She was diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder. The judge described Mary as a dangerous individual who posed a very grave risk to other children. He sentenced her to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which meant she would be imprisoned indefinitely until authorities decided she could safely be released into society. Mary Bell spent the next 12 years in various institutions. She was initially held in remand homes before being transferred to a secure unit at a young offenders institution, where she was the only female inmate. Mary later claimed she was sexually abused by a staff member and several inmates while imprisoned at this facility. In November 1973, when she was 16, she was transferred to another prison and reportedly resented the move. She unsuccessfully applied for parole. In September 1977, when Mary was 20 years old, she and another inmate named Annette Priest escaped from the open prison where they were being held. They absconded to Blackpool with 2 men and stayed at various local hotels, where Mary used the alias Mary Robinson. She dyed her hair blonde in an attempt to disguise herself. The police recaptured Mary on the 13th of September 1977 at the Derbyshire home of one of the men. She was returned to custody and lost prison privileges for 28 days. In June 1979, authorities transferred Mary to an open prison to prepare her for eventual release. Beginning in November 1979, Mary worked under supervision, first as a secretary and then as a waitress at a cafe in York Minster. Mary Bell was finally released from prison in May 1980 at the age of 23, after serving nearly 12 years in custody. She was granted anonymity and given a new name and identity, allowing her to start a new life under an assumed identity. On the 25th of May, 1984, exactly 16 years after she murdered Martin Brown, Mary gave birth to a daughter. The girl grew up unaware of her mother's true identity. In 1998, journalist Gitta Sereny published a book titled Cries Unheard: The Story of Mary Bell, which featured interviews with Mary about her childhood and crimes. When the book was published, Mary's teenage daughter discovered for the first time that her mother was a convicted child killer. The revelation caused significant trauma. In May 2003, Mary Bell won a high court battle to have her anonymity, and that of her daughter, extended for life. Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss, president of the Family Division, approved this order. The judge stated that the exceptional features of the case merited such protection. She noted that Mary and her partner had created a largely settled life in the community and had raised a well-balanced daughter. The anonymity order was later extended to include Mary Bell's granddaughter, born in January 2009 and referred to in legal documents as Z. The order prohibits anyone from revealing any details about their lives that might identify them. Mary Bell's case remains one of the most disturbing in British criminal history. She became one of the youngest convicted killers in the United Kingdom. The case raised profound questions about the age of criminal responsibility, the role of childhood trauma in creating violent behavior, and whether society failed to protect both Mary and her victims. Mary Bell's whereabouts today remain unknown and protected by court order. According to Gitta Sereny, Mary does not claim she was wrongly convicted and freely admits that the abuse she suffered as a child does not excuse her crimes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the James Bulger case killers, Robert Thompson and John Venables, UK, 1993. The James Bulger case killers Robert Thompson and John Venables, UK, 1993. James Patrick Bulger was born on the 16th of March, 1990, in Kirkby, England. He was the son of Ralph and Denise Bulger, who had previously lost a daughter who was stillborn. James was a healthy baby with big blue eyes and light brown hair. He was a happy child who loved trains and cartoon characters. His mother, Denise, was 25 years old and very protective of her son. Nobody could have imagined that a routine shopping trip would end in one of the most shocking crimes in British history. On Friday, the 12th of February, 1993, Denise took 2-year-old James to the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, a town near Liverpool in Merseyside, England. That same afternoon, 2 10-year-old boys were wandering through the shopping centre. Robert Thompson and John Venables were skipping school that day, something they did regularly. Security cameras captured them casually observing children throughout the afternoon, apparently selecting a target. The boys spent the day shoplifting items including sweets, batteries, a troll doll, and a can of blue Humbrol modeling paint. Robert Thompson was born on the 23rd of August 1982 in Liverpool. He was the fifth of 7 children in a chaotic and violent household. His father had abandoned the family 5 years before the murder, leaving his mother Anne devastated. Anne Thompson came from an abusive background herself and had married Robert's father at age 18 to escape beatings from her own father, but her husband was an aggressive alcoholic who beat Anne in front of the children. Anne also beat her sons with sticks and belts and attempted suicide with pill overdoses before turning to alcohol. The Thompson home was filled with violence, with older brothers beating younger ones. Robert himself had been beaten and sexually molested by his father and older brothers. At school, teachers found him shy and quiet but manipulative. He was known mainly as a truant who roamed the streets late at night. John Venables was born on the 13th of August, 1982, also in Liverpool, just 10 days before Thompson. His parents were separated, and while there was no evidence of severe physical violence in his home, John's mother, Susan, suffered from psychiatric problems and frequently felt overwhelmed with parenting. She was described as a strict and harsh parent, and John later spoke of his fear of her. The separation of his parents affected John deeply. While the Venables family was more financially comfortable than the Thompsons, John showed behavioral problems at school and was known to bully other children. By early 1993, Thompson and Venables had become good friends. They were both known as rule breakers, who stole from stores and caused minor trouble. One of the boys later admitted that before they abducted James Bulger, they had been planning to abduct a child, lead him to the busy road alongside the shopping center, and push him into oncoming traffic to make it look like an accident. Earlier that afternoon, Thompson and Venables had attempted to abduct another 2-year-old boy, but the child's mother spotted what was happening and intervened, pulling her son back. The boys did not give up and continued looking for another victim. At approximately 3:40 inches the afternoon, Denise Bulger was in A.R. Tim's butcher shop on the lower floor of the shopping center. She let go of James's hand for just a moment to pay for her shopping. When she looked down, James was gone. She immediately panicked and alerted security. Police were called and Denise frantically searched the shopping center, but James had vanished. Security camera footage later showed what happened. Thompson and Venables had spotted James by the door of the butcher shop. With his mother distracted, they approached the toddler. John Venables took James by the hand and led him away. At 3:42 p.m., cameras captured the three of them leaving the shopping center. To anyone watching, they looked like two older brothers taking their little brother for a walk. Several shoppers noticed them and later remembered seeing the boys. Sometimes James ran ahead, and the older boys would call out, "Come on, baby," beckoning him back. Once outside, James began crying for his mother. The boys ignored his cries and kept walking. They led James on a journey that would cover 2.5 miles across Liverpool, from Bootle to Walton. Along this route, approximately 38 people saw the three boys together. Most assumed Thompson and Venables were related to James or were helping a lost child. A few people noticed something seemed wrong, especially as James became more distressed, but nobody intervened. The boys led James to a canal where they dropped him on his head, causing injuries to his face and forehead. They joked about pushing him into the water. One witness later described James at the canal as crying his eyes out. After the fall, his forehead was bruised and bleeding. Thompson and Venables pulled the hood of James's coat over his head to try to hide the injury, but passers-by could still see the wound and tears on his cheek. The boys continued walking with James through neighborhoods and streets. At one point, they took him into a pet shop, but were quickly ejected. They walked past Walton Lane Police Station, hesitated for a moment, then led James up a steep bank to a railway line near the former Walton and Anfield railway station. What happened next was a brutal and prolonged attack. One of the boys threw the blue paint they had stolen into James's left eye. They kicked him and stamped on him. They threw bricks and stones at his body. They shoved batteries into his mouth, and police later believed batteries may have also been inserted into his anus, though none were found there. The boys stripped James from the waist down, removing his shoes, socks, trousers, and underpants. The attack was savage. A heavy iron bar weighing 22 pounds, described in court as a railway fish plate, was dropped on James's head, causing 10 skull fractures. The pathologist who examined James's body, Dr. Alan Williams, counted 22 wounds on his head and face, and another 20 on his body. James sustained 42 separate injuries in total. The wounds were so numerous and severe that Dr. Williams could not determine which single blow had killed him. He testified that James would have died from the massive head injuries after only a short period of survival once the attack began. The brain damage was extensive and included a severe hemorrhage. A forensic scientist later matched a pattern of bruising on James's right cheek to the upper part of a shoe worn by Robert Thompson. The imprint of Thompson's shoelaces was found on James's face. A paint mark in John Venables' shoe showed he had used significant force when kicking James. The pathologist noted that James's foreskin had been forcibly pulled back, leading police to suspect a sexual element to the crime, though both boys later denied this. After James was dead, Thompson and Venables laid his body across the railway tracks. They weighted his head down with rubble and bricks, hoping a passing train would strike him and make his death appear accidental. They left him there and walked away. James's body was later severed in two by a train, but forensic examination confirmed he had already died from his injuries before the train hit him. James's disappearance made the evening news that night. Calls poured into the police station from people who believed they had seen the toddler. After midnight, authorities watched the security videos from the shopping center. The CCTV footage showed James being led away by two figures. Initial reports described them as youths, implying teenagers. Nobody suspected the abductors were children. On Sunday, the 14th of February 1993, James's body was discovered on the railway line by four boys looking for footballs. The site was just 200 yards from Walton Lane Police Station. When police arrived, they found James's body had been severed. His upper body was in one location, hidden in his coat, while his lower half was further down the tracks, completely naked. His removed clothing was laid near his head, and his underwear was heavily soaked with blood. Near the body, police found the iron bar with blood stains, many bricks and stones covered in blood, 3 AA batteries, and the tin of blue paint. News of the discovery horrified the nation. The brutality inflicted on a 2-year-old child sparked massive public outrage. Police initially dismissed the idea that children could have committed such a crime and focused on adult suspects. The breakthrough came from a local woman who recognized one of the boys in the CCTV images broadcast on television. She knew Thompson and Venables had been skipping school the day James disappeared. On the 18th of February 1993, 6 days after the murder, police brought both boys in for questioning. Thompson and Venables were taken to separate police stations. Both had samples of blood, hair, and fingernails taken. The interviews were recorded and captured over 20 hours of questioning. Robert Thompson initially denied everything. He tried hard not to incriminate himself and attempted to appear cooperative while providing little information. Investigators later described him as street smart, clever, and manipulative. However, Thompson made critical mistakes. He gave detailed information about what James was wearing, information he should not have known. He also asked police if they had taken James to the hospital to get him alive again, a strange question that suggested guilt. John Venables initially resisted, but on the afternoon of February 19, while alone with his parents, he broke down and confessed. The police were listening through surveillance equipment. Venables blurted out, "I did kill him. What about his mom? Will you tell her I'm sorry?" With this confession, police had enough to charge both boys. On Saturday, the 20th of February 1993, Thompson and Venables were formally charged with the abduction and murder of James Bulger. They were only 10 years old, making them the youngest people to face murder charges in modern British history. They appeared at South Sefton Youth Court on the 22nd of February 1993 and were remanded in custody to await trial. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Tests confirmed both boys had the same blue paint on their clothing, as was found on James's body. Blood on Thompson's shoe matched James's DNA. The pattern of bruising on James's cheek matched Thompson's shoe. Paint marks in Venables' shoes showed he had used force when kicking James. Up to 500 protesters gathered at court during the boys' initial appearances. Public rage was immense. Both families had to be moved to different parts of the country for their safety. The trial opened at Preston Crown Court on the 1st of November 1993. Both boys were now 11 years old. The controversial decision was made to try them as adults, with full legal proceedings, including judges and officials in wigs and robes. The boys sat in the dock away from their parents on raised chairs so they could see over the adult-sized dock. They were accompanied by social workers and guards. During the trial, the boys were referred to as Child A, Thompson, and Child B, Venables, but at the end, the judge waived their anonymity and allowed their names to be published. Both pleaded not guilty to charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction. The attempted abduction charge related to the earlier incident when they tried to take another boy before his mother intervened. The jury was shown the murder weapons. Blood-stained bricks, stones, and the heavy metal bar were passed around in clear plastic bags. James's clothing, including his underpants, was presented as evidence. Dr. Alan Williams spent 33 minutes outlining the horrific injuries James sustained. Many injuries to his legs were inflicted after he was stripped. The testimony was harrowing and shocked everyone in the courtroom. Lawrence Lee, Venables' solicitor, later said Robert Thompson was one of the most frightening children he had ever seen, comparing him to the Pied Piper. After court appearances, John Venables would strip off his clothes in his cell, saying, "I can smell James like a baby smell." Child psychiatrists examined both boys. They confirmed that despite their young age, both Thompson and Venables knew the difference between right and wrong. They understood it was wrong to take a child from his mother and wrong to hurt him. One psychiatrist stated, Thompson suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after the attack. Detective Phil Roberts, who questioned both boys, later said, "As far as I'm concerned, that day I stared evil in the face. I think Thompson was in charge, but they both attacked James. They were a match made in hell, a freak of nature. They went out that day to kill, and if they hadn't been caught, I fear they would have struck again." On the 24th of November 1993, after 3 weeks of evidence, the jury took 6 hours to reach their verdict. Robert Thompson and John Venables were found guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger. At age 11, they became the youngest convicted murderers in modern English history. James's parents broke down in tears when the verdict was announced. Mr. Justice Moreland sentenced them, saying, "The killing of James Bulger was an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity." He sentenced them to indefinite detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, recommending a minimum of 8 years before parole consideration. The judge's decision to release the boys' names had severe consequences for their families, who faced death threats and had to move repeatedly to escape attacks. Thompson and Venables spent 8 years in secure facilities, receiving education and psychological treatment. In June 2001, when both were 18, a parole board recommended their release. The decision sparked outrage, but the board determined they had been rehabilitated. Both were given new identities and lifelong anonymity orders protecting their names, locations, and any identifying details. Their paths diverged after release. Robert Thompson has not reoffended and has lived quietly under his new identity for over 2 decades. Reports suggest he is in a long-term relationship, though this has never been confirmed. John Venables, however, returned to prison multiple times. In 2008, he was cautioned for cocaine possession. In February 2010, he was sent back to prison for possessing child abuse images. In July 2010, he was sentenced to 2 years after admitting to downloading and distributing indecent images of children. He was released in 2013 with a second new identity, but was arrested again in November 2017 for possessing over 1,000 indecent images of children. He was sentenced to 40 months. James's father, Ralph Bulger, launched legal attempts to strip Venables of his anonymity, but in March 2019, courts rejected this, ruling it would put Venables at risk of death from vigilante attacks. In December 2023, the parole board rejected Venables' latest appeal for release, stating he remained dangerous and not rehabilitated. The James Bulger case profoundly impacted British society, sparking debate about the age of criminal responsibility, how to handle child offenders, and whether rehabilitation is possible for children who commit such crimes. In 1999, the European Court of Human Rights ruled Thompson and Venables had not received a fair trial because trying them in an adult court at such a young age was inappropriate. James's mother, Denise Fergus, has remained in the public eye, campaigning for justice system changes and ensuring her son's case is never forgotten. She stated, "I can never forgive Thompson and Venables for the horrendous, calculated, cold-blooded murder of James." James Bulger is buried in Kirkdale Cemetery in Liverpool, where people continue to leave flowers and tributes. The case remains one of the most notorious crimes in modern British history, a tragedy that shattered assumptions about childhood innocence and forced society to confront the disturbing reality that children are capable of unimaginable evil. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Susan Smith filicide of 2 Sons USA, 1994. Susan Smith filicide of 2 sons, USA, 1994. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on the 26th of September 1971 in Union, South Carolina. She was the 3rd child and only daughter of Harry Ray Vaughn, a mill worker, and Linda Sue Harrison. Susan was a daddy's girl who adored her father. The family seemed relatively normal until tragedy struck when Susan was just 6 years old. In January 1977, Linda Sue filed for divorce. People who knew the family said she had met a new man and wanted to end her marriage. 4 months later, in the spring of 1977, Harry Vaughn shot himself in the chest and died by suicide. The loss devastated young Susan and would haunt her for the rest of her life. She kept his coin collection and an audio tape of his voice in her bureau drawer. In 1979, when Susan was 8 years old, her mother married Beverly C. Russell Jr., a local businessman who was a divorced father of 3 children. Russell eventually became prominent in South Carolina's Republican Party and the Christian Coalition, a conservative Christian political organization. To outsiders, the family appeared stable. Susan's brother Scotty later said that Russell was the force that held the family together. But behind closed doors, something dark was happening. When Susan was 15 years old and a junior in high school, Beverly Russell sexually molested her. The abuse began one evening when he groped and kissed her while she was on his lap. Susan told her mother, Linda, and a high school guidance counselor what Russell had done. When Linda confronted him, Russell did not deny the accusations. Sheriff's records show that Russell admitted to fondling Susan. The family sought counseling, and Russell agreed to move out of the house for a short time. But the abuse did not stop. In February 1988, Susan again complained to a guidance counselor about Russell's behavior. However, in the end, Linda and Susan decided not to press charges against Russell. He was a powerful man with political connections, and the family did not want the scandal. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the sexual contact between Susan and her stepfather continued into her adult life. Both Russell and Susan later admitted that they had sexual relations that continued until as recently as 6 months before Susan murdered her children. Susan at one point told a psychiatrist that she viewed the relationship as a consensual affair and that she was happy about it because she was jealous that her mother was getting all of Russell's attention. Whether this was truly consensual or whether Susan had been manipulated into believing this is a question that haunted the case. The trauma of her father's suicide and the sexual abuse by her stepfather deeply affected Susan's mental health. At age 13, she attempted suicide. After graduating from Union High School in 1989, Susan made a second suicide attempt after a married man she was having a relationship with ended their affair. She then went to work at the local Winn-Dixie supermarket as a checkout girl. There she met David Smith, who worked as a produce clerk. Susan was 2 months pregnant with David's child when they married on the 15th of March 1991. Their first son, Michael Daniel Smith, was born later that year. Their second son, Alexander Tyler Smith, was born in 1993. On the surface, Susan appeared to be a doting mother, but the marriage slowly unraveled. Both Susan and David had affairs. In September 1994, Susan filed for divorce, alleging infidelity. David later countersued, also alleging infidelity. The couple separated but maintained contact for the sake of their children. In December 1993, Susan had started dating Tom Findley, a 27-year-old graphic artist who was the son of the owner of Conso Products, the company where Susan worked as a secretary. Findley was wealthy and considered a catch in Union. Susan told him she and David were separated. The relationship lasted for 2 to 3 months before Findley broke it off in March 1994, when he discovered Susan was still living with David. They began dating again in September 1994 after Susan and David's final separation. According to Findley, he and Susan slept together about 10 times during their relationship. On the 17th of October 1994, just 8 days before Susan murdered her children, Tom Findley wrote her a 2-page letter breaking off their relationship permanently. In the letter, he explained that their relationship was doomed because they came from completely different backgrounds. More significantly, he wrote that he was not ready to be a father to her children. He said he could see himself with Susan, but not with the responsibility of being a stepfather. This letter devastated Susan. She had pinned her hopes for a better life on Findlay and his wealth. She believed that her children were the only obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. On the evening of the 25th of October 1994, Susan picked up 3-year-old Michael and 4-month-old Alexander from daycare. She was upset about the breakup with Findlay. She told a friend, "I may just end it." That night, Susan made a decision that would shock the nation. She strapped her 2 sons into their car seats in her 1990 Mazda Protégé sedan. In the trunk, she placed her wedding album and wedding dress. She drove to John D. Long Lake, an isolated place on a dead-end road just outside Union. Susan pulled up to a boat ramp at the lake. She got out of the car, released the parking brake, and let the vehicle roll down the ramp and into the water. Later, reenactments by investigators would show that the car floated approximately 88 feet from shore before the front end began to sink. It took approximately 6 minutes for the water to completely fill the car, drown the children, and for the vehicle to sink to the bottom of the lake in 18 feet of water. The car settled upside down. Michael and Alexander died strapped in their car seats, calling for their mother as the dark water rose around them. After the car disappeared beneath the surface, Susan ran to the nearby home of Shirley McLeod, which was about a quarter mile from the lake. She frantically knocked on the door around 9 o'clock at night. "Please help me. He's got my kids and my car. A black man has got my kids and my car," she told the family inside. Susan claimed she had been stopped at a red light at the Monarch Mills intersection in Union when a black man wearing a black sweatshirt and a dark cap jumped into her car armed with a gun. She said he put the gun in her side and told her to shut up and drive. After driving about 5 miles along Highway 49, she claimed the man told her to stop and get out. When she begged to take her sons, she said the man told her he did not have time and promised he would not hurt them. She claimed he then pushed her out of the car and drove away with Michael and Alexander still inside. The McLeod family called the police and Susan's mother, Linda. When Linda arrived, one of the first things she did was scold Susan for not locking her car doors. Susan repeated her story to Union County Sheriff Howard Wells and other investigators. The search for the missing children began immediately. Local, state, and federal agents established a command post at the Union County Courthouse. On October 26, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division flew helicopters over John D. Long Lake and nearby Sumter National Forest using heat sensors to try to find the car and children. Police dogs searched throughout Union. Divers searched the lake but found nothing because they did not search far enough out from the shore. A sketch artist met with Susan and created a composite drawing of the alleged carjacker based on her description. She said he was around 40 years old, black, wearing a plaid jacket, dark shirt, jeans, and a dark toboggan hat. The sketch was posted in store windows throughout Union. Yellow ribbons were tied on trees along Main Street. The nation became transfixed by the story of the missing boys. Susan and her estranged husband David appeared together at press conferences, making tearful pleas for the safe return of their children. "Pleas to the guy, to the man. Me and my wife plead to him to please return our children to us safely," David said. Susan clutched David's hand and told television cameras, please bring them home. I can't express how much they are wanted back home, how much we love them and miss them." David believed Susan completely. The couple presented a united front to the world. For 9 days, the community and the entire nation rallied behind the Smiths. Hundreds of volunteers joined authorities to search for the boys. Calls of support came from across the United States. The Adam Walsh Foundation, an organization that helped find missing children, got involved. But from the very beginning, investigators had serious doubts about Susan's story. Sheriff Wells and South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Chief Robert Stewart noticed inconsistencies immediately. Investigators learned from the Department of Transportation that Susan's story was impossible. She claimed she was stopped at a red light at the Monarch Mills intersection when the carjacking occurred. However, the traffic light at that location was programmed to stay green for the main road unless a car approached on the cross street. With no other cars around at that time of night, the light would not have been red. Additionally, more than 100 officers and volunteers searched the area along Highway 49, where Susan claimed the carjacking occurred, but they found no trace of the boys or the vehicle. Investigators also discovered discrepancies in Susan's story about where she was going that night. She said she was heading to visit a friend, but that friend was not even home. When Susan took a lie detector test, she had extreme difficulty answering the question, "Do you know where your boys are?" The test showed deception. Behind the scenes, investigators were building a case. They interviewed people in Susan's life and discovered her relationship with Tom Findlay. They obtained a copy of the letter Findlay had written to Susan just 8 days before the murders, breaking up with her because he did not want to be a father to her children. Investigators believed they had found a motive. They thought Susan had murdered her sons to remove the obstacle that stood between her and the life she wanted with Findlay. On the 2nd of November 1994, Susan and David Smith appeared on several national television programs, continuing to plead for the safe return of their children. But the net was closing around Susan. On the 3rd of November 1994, Sheriff Wells confronted Susan at a church that was being used as a command center. Wells lied to Susan, telling her he knew her story was false because he had undercover officers working a drug investigation at the Carlisle intersection where she claimed to be stopped. This was not true, but it was enough to break Susan down. Susan cried out and confessed what she had done. At 5:05 p.m., she signed a handwritten confession admitting that she had drowned her sons by letting her car roll into John D. Long Lake. In her confession, Susan wrote, "I was in love with someone very much, but he did not love me and never would. I had never felt so lonely and so sad. I dropped to the lowest when I allowed my children to go down that ramp into the water without me. I wanted to turn around so bad and go back, but I knew it was too late. I knew from day one the truth would prevail, but I was so scared I didn't know what to do." She claimed she had intended to kill herself along with her children because she did not want them to grow up without a mother, but that she got out of the car at the last moment. Later that evening, divers from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources recovered Susan's Mazda from the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Michael and Alexander's bodies were still inside, strapped into their car seats. The discovery was devastating for the divers and investigators. One diver later described seeing a small hand pressed against the window of the submerged vehicle. Sheriff Wells held a press conference that night, announcing Susan Smith had been charged with 2 counts of murder for the drowning deaths of her sons. When news spread through Union, gasps could be heard from the crowd of townspeople and media who had gathered. The betrayal was enormous. For 9 days, the community and the entire nation had searched for the boys and supported Susan and David. People had prayed for the children's safe return. Now they learned that Susan had lied from the beginning and that the boys had been dead at the bottom of the lake the entire time. The fact that Susan had blamed a fictional black man for the crime added a racial dimension that made the betrayal even worse. In the racially tense climate of the Deep South in 1994, Susan's false accusation could have led to violence against innocent people. On the 6th of November 1994, 3 days after Susan's confession, hundreds of mourners attended the funeral for Michael and Alexander. The 2 boys were buried together in a single casket. David Smith was grief-stricken, weeping openly as he laid his sons to rest while Susan remained in jail. Susan was indicted by the state grand jury on 2 charges of murder on the 12th of December 1994. In January 1995, 16th Circuit Solicitor Tommy Pope announced that he would seek the death penalty. The trial began on the 10th of July 1995 at the Union County Courthouse. Susan's defense team included high-profile attorneys David Bruck and Judy Clark. Clark would later go on to defend Unabomber Ted Kaczynski and Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. The prosecution argued that Susan murdered her sons in a calculated attempt to start a new life with Tom Findlay. They presented the letter Findlay had written breaking up with her. They pointed to the fact that Susan had her wedding album and wedding dress in the trunk of the car. suggesting she was symbolically trying to walk away from her entire life with David. Prosecutors played a video for the jury showing a reenactment of the crime. Investigators had restored Susan's car and used it along with an identical vehicle to demonstrate exactly how the car had rolled into the lake and sunk. The video showed that the car floated for nearly 6 minutes before disappearing beneath the water, meaning Susan had plenty of time to save her children but chose not to. Tommy Pope emphasized that when Susan ran for help, she was not wet and not injured, contradicting her claim that she had intended to die with her sons. The defense argued that Susan was deeply troubled, suffering from severe depression and dependent personality disorder. Defense attorney Judy Clark told the jury, "This is not a case about evil. This is a case about despair and sadness." The defense claimed Susan had driven to the lake to commit suicide and take her children with her, so they would not grow up without a mother, but that her survival instinct had forced her out of the car at the last moment. The defense focused heavily on Susan's traumatic childhood, including her father's suicide and the years of sexual abuse by her stepfather Beverly Russell. Beverly Russell testified at the trial, making a stunning admission. He acknowledged that he had molested Susan when she was a teenager and that their sexual relationship had continued even after she was married to David. Russell admitted having sexual encounters with Susan as recently as August 1994, less than 3 months before she killed her sons. On the witness stand, Russell sobbed as he read from a letter he had written to Susan on Father's Day 1995 while she was in prison. "You don't have all the guilt in this tragedy," he read. "Had I been true to you in my responsibilities, you would have been stronger in yourself. My heart breaks for what I've done to you, for your pain and for your loss." Russell asked the jury to spare Susan's life, saying he bore some responsibility for what happened. David Smith also testified, providing tearful testimony about the loss of his sons. "All my hopes and dreams, everything that I had planned for the rest of my life, it ended that day," he said emotionally. He told the jury about the pain Susan had caused not only to Michael and Alexander, but to everyone who loved them. It took the jury only 2.5 hours to convict Susan Smith of 2 counts of murder on the 22nd of July, 1995. The penalty phase of the trial then began to determine whether Susan would be sentenced to death or life in prison. Tommy Pope argued passionately for the death penalty, but the defense continued to emphasize Susan's mental health issues and traumatic past. The jury ultimately voted against imposing the death penalty. Instead, Susan was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Under South Carolina law at the time, life did not mean life without parole. In 1996, the legislature changed the law so that life sentences truly meant life. But this change came too late to affect Susan's case. When the jury sentenced her to life, many jurors believed she would never be released. They did not know that she would become eligible for parole after serving 30 years. Susan Smith was initially incarcerated at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, before being transferred to the Leith Correctional Institution near Greenwood. Her behavior in prison has been problematic. She has been disciplined multiple times for various infractions, including having inappropriate contact with prison guards and communicating with a filmmaker about her case in violation of prison rules. These disciplinary issues have damaged her chances for early release. David Smith remarried and had 2 more children. He built a new life but never forgot Michael and Alexander. He has not spoken to Susan since shortly after her confession 30 years ago. Beverly Russell resigned from his political positions after the scandal became public, admitting he was responsible and ashamed of what happened. Linda Russell, Susan's mother, published a book in 2000 titled My Daughter Susan Smith, in which she tried to explain and understand why Susan did what she did. Linda claimed that Susan had simply lost touch with reality at the moment she murdered her sons. On the 20th of November 2024, Susan Smith appeared before the South Carolina Parole Board for her first parole hearing, exactly 30 years after she became eligible. David Smith attended the hearing along with 14 other witnesses who spoke in opposition to her release. David gave an emotional statement saying, What she did not only to Michael and Alex, she came pretty close to causing me to end my life because of the grief she brought upon me. I would just tell her that you have no idea of how much damage you have done to so many people. Tommy Pope, the prosecutor who is now a South Carolina state representative, also spoke against her release, arguing that Susan had always been focused on herself and had shown no genuine remorse. Susan Smith addressed the parole board, claiming she was truly remorseful for her actions. Her attorney told the board his client was sorry for what she had done. However, the parole board unanimously voted to deny her release. The board cited the serious nature of her crimes, her disciplinary record in prison, and the impact on the victim's family. Susan Smith will have to wait at least 2 more years before she can seek parole again. The case of Susan Smith remains one of the most notorious crimes in American history. It shocked the nation not only because of the brutal way she murdered her own children, but because of the elaborate lie she told and the racial accusations she made. The image of Susan's car slowly sinking into John D. Long Lake with her 2 helpless boys strapped inside haunts everyone who followed the case. Michael and Alexander Smith never had a chance at life. They were murdered by the one person who should have protected them above all others. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Andrea Yates filicide of 5 children, USA, 2001. Andrea Yates filicide of 5 children, USA, 2001. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on the 2nd of July, 1964, in Houston, Texas. She was the youngest of 5 children in a Roman Catholic family. Her mother was Jutta Karen Kohler, a German immigrant, and her father was Andrew Emmett Kennedy, whose parents came from Ireland. Andrea grew up in a normal middle-class household and showed great promise from an early age. She excelled in school and was very athletic. During her teenage years, she struggled with bulimia and depression. When she was 17 years old, she told a friend that she had thoughts about suicide. Despite these early warning signs of mental illness, Andrea continued to push forward with her education and career goals. Andrea graduated from Milby High School in Houston in 1982. She was the class valedictorian, which meant she had the highest grades in her entire graduating class. She was also the captain of the swim team and served as an officer in the National Honor Society. After high school, Andrea completed a 2-year pre-nursing program at the University of Houston. She then graduated from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston and became a registered nurse. From 1986 until 1994, Andrea worked as a nurse at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, one of the most respected cancer treatment facilities in the world. She was considered an excellent nurse and was well liked by her colleagues and patients. In the summer of 1989, Andrea met Russell Yates at the Sunscape Apartments in Houston. Russell, who went by the nickname Rusty, was an engineer working for NASA on the Space Shuttle program. The two began dating and soon moved in together. They were married on the 17th of April 1993. Andrea was 29 years old when she got married. After the wedding, she gave up her nursing career to become a full-time housewife and mother. This decision would prove to be significant in her mental health decline, as she lost much of her independence and identity outside of her role as a wife and mother. The Yates family was heavily influenced by a traveling evangelical preacher named Michael Woroniecki. Rusty had first met Woroniecki in the mid-1982s while Woroniecki was preaching on the campus of Auburn University in Alabama, where Rusty was a student. Rusty was impressed by the preacher and took some of his religious literature. The two men stayed in touch by mail over the years. In 1989, Rusty introduced Andrea to Woroniecki and his family. Woroniecki was not part of any established church but traveled around the country with his wife Rachel and their 6 children, living in a converted bus and preaching at college campuses, sporting events, and other large gatherings. Woroniecki's religious teachings were extreme and focused heavily on sin, damnation, and hellfire. He preached that parents, especially mothers, were responsible for ensuring the salvation of their children's souls. He believed that bad mothers who were bound for hell would create bad children who would also go to hell. He taught that parents should be willing to commit suicide rather than cause their children to stumble and end up in eternal damnation. Woronietzki also held very traditional views about gender roles. He believed that women were weak and sinful because of Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden, and that a woman's proper role was to submit to her husband and stay at home to care for children. The Yates family began to pattern their lives after the Woronietzki family. They had Bible study meetings in their home 3 nights a week, but did not attend any local church. Rusty made all the major decisions for the family, and Andrea dutifully followed his wishes. Her best friend Debbie Holmes later described Rusty as controlling, critical, and demanding. Andrea's mother and Debbie both said that Andrea lost her own identity after getting married and seemed to have no voice in family decisions. The couple decided to have a large family like the Woronieckis. All of their children would be given biblical names, just like Woronietzki's children. The Yates family even bought a used bus from the Woronieckis in 1998 and lived in it for a time, despite the cramped conditions. Andrea gave birth to her first child, Noah Jacob, in February 1994. Her second son, John Samuel, was born in December 1995. Her third son, Paul Abraham, was born in September 1997. During this time, the family moved to Seminole, Florida for Rusty's work. They lived in a 3/8 square foot travel trailer for about a year before moving back to Houston in 1997. Andrea gave birth to her fourth son, Luke David, in February 1999. By this time, she was responsible for caring for 4 young boys while also homeschooling them. She was the sole caretaker for the children and managed all the household duties. The stress of caring for so many young children while living in cramped conditions began to take a serious toll on Andrea's mental health. In June 1999, just 4 months after Luke was born, Andrea experienced her first major mental breakdown. On the 16th of June 1999, Rusty came home to find Andrea shaking uncontrollably and chewing on her fingers. The next day, June 17, she overdosed on pills in a suicide attempt. She was rushed to the Methodist Hospital psychiatric unit, where she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. When she was released from the hospital, Andrea begged Rusty to let her die. She held a knife up to her own neck, trying to find the right vein to cut. On July 21, 1999, she was admitted to Memorial Spring Shadows Glen Hospital for psychiatric treatment after another suicide attempt. She was treated as both an inpatient and outpatient for 2 months and was prescribed Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic medication. Her condition improved dramatically with the Haldol treatment. Andrea's psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, strongly advised Andrea and Rusty not to have any more children. Dr. Starbranch testified that she told them having another baby would guarantee future psychotic depression. She was shocked when, during an office visit, the couple expressed a desire to stop Andrea's medications so she could become pregnant again. Despite the doctor's warnings, Andrea stopped taking Haldol in March 2000. 7 weeks after being discharged from psychiatric care, she became pregnant with her 5th child. She gave birth to a daughter, Mary Deborah, on the 30th of November 2000. For several months after Mary's birth, Andrea seemed to be coping reasonably well, but everything changed on the 12th of March 2001, when her father died. Andrea's father had been suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and Andrea had been helping to care for him in addition to her other responsibilities. His death triggered a severe mental breakdown. Andrea stopped taking all of her medications. She began mutilating herself by scratching her head so violently that she created bald spots. She read the Bible constantly and feverishly. She stopped feeding her baby daughter Mary. She became so sick that she could barely function at all. On the 31st of March 2001, Rusty and Andrea's brother took her to Devereaux, Texas Treatment Network, a psychiatric hospital in League City, Texas. She came under the care of Dr. Mohammed Saeed, who was the medical director at the facility. When Dr. Saeed first saw Andrea, he wanted to have her committed to a state mental hospital because her condition was so severe. However, she was not committed. Instead, after 2 weeks of treatment at Devereaux, she was discharged on the 13th of April 2001. During this stay, Dr. Saeed prescribed Risperdal, an antipsychotic medication. Andrea's condition worsened rapidly after her discharge. On the 3rd of May 2001, Rusty came home to find that Andrea had filled the bathtub with water in the middle of the day. She later confessed to police that she had planned to drown her children that day but changed her mind at the last minute. Psychiatrists believed she had actually filled the tub to drown herself. The next day, the 4th of May 2001, Andrea was readmitted to Devereux. During this second hospitalization, Dr. Saeed prescribed Haldol, the same medication that had worked so well for Andrea during her 1999 breakdown. He also dramatically increased her dose of the antidepressant Effexor from 200 mg per day to 450 mg per day, which was twice the recommended maximum dose. Andrea was discharged from Devereux again on the 14th of May 2001. The hospital had no choice but to release her because her insurance company, Blue Cross Blue Shield, would only cover 10 days of psychiatric hospitalization. Even though the hospital staff knew Andrea was still very sick, they had to send her home. Rusty later testified that he noticed the staff lowering their heads in shame and embarrassment as they discharged his wife, but they could not say anything because of the insurance restrictions. On the 4th of June 2001, Dr. Saeed made a fateful decision. During an outpatient visit at his office, he discontinued Andrea's prescription for Haldol. He said he was concerned about side effects and believed the medication was hindering her progress. He also said he saw no evidence of psychosis. This decision would prove to be catastrophic. Medical experts later testified that it takes 4 to 6 days for Haldol to be completely eliminated from the body after discontinuation. Andrea's psychosis returned as the medication left her system. Dr. Saeed had given Rusty very clear instructions not to leave Andrea alone with the children. He told Rusty that Andrea needed to be supervised around the clock. However, Rusty began leaving Andrea alone for short periods of time because he believed it would help her become more independent. He announced at a family gathering on the weekend before the murders that he had decided to leave Andrea home alone for 1 hour each morning and 1 hour each evening. Andrea's mother expressed shock and concern at this plan, saying that Andrea was not stable enough to care for the children alone. Andrea's brother Brian later testified that while driving Andrea to a mental health facility, Rusty had said that depressed people just needed a swift kick in the pants to get motivated. On the 18th of June 2001, Rusty took Andrea to see Dr. Saeed for what would be her last appointment before the murders. By this time, Andrea was in terrible condition. She was not eating well, was not having conversations, and Rusty did his most of the talking during the appointment. Her condition was clearly declining. Despite this, Dr. Saeed did not put her back on Haldol or admit her to the hospital. He asked about suicidal thoughts, but did not ask whether she might harm anyone else. The 20th of June, 2001, started as an ordinary summer day in the suburban Houston neighborhood of Clear Lake City. The Yates family lived in a modest house on Beachcomber Lane. At around 9:00 the morning, Rusty left for work at the Johnson Space Center, where he worked as a NASA engineer. His mother, Dora Yates, was scheduled to arrive at 10 to help Andrea with the children. This left Andrea alone with all 5 children for 1 hour. The children ranged in age from 7-year-old Noah to 6-month-old baby Mary. During that 1 hour, Andrea Yates methodically drowned each of her 5 children in the bathtub. She later told police that she drowned them in no particular order. She started with Paul, Luke, and John. After drowning each child, she carried their bodies to the master bedroom and placed them on the double bed. She drowned baby Mary next and left her floating in the bathtub. Noah, the oldest at 7 years old, came into the bathroom and saw his baby sister in the tub. He asked what was wrong with Mary. He realized something terrible was happening and tried to run away, but Andrea caught him. Noah was the hardest to drown because he was the strongest. He managed to get his head above the water and said, "I'm sorry, Mommy." Andrea drowned him and left his body floating in the bathtub. She then went back to the bedroom and placed baby Mary in the crook of John's arm. She did this because John had been a particularly good big brother. and she wanted him to protect Mary in the afterlife. After all 5 children were dead, Andrea called 911. She repeatedly told the dispatcher that she needed a police officer to come to her house, but she refused to say why. She then called Rusty at work and told him he needed to come home right away. When a police officer arrived at the house and asked Andrea what was wrong, she immediately confessed. She said, "I killed my kids." The police officer went into the house and found the horrifying scene. All 5 children were dead. 4 of them were laid out on the bed, and Noah's body was still in the bathtub. Police officers and reporters who were at the scene later said it was one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever witnessed. Police officers were crying. When they brought Andrea out of the house, her clothes and hair were still wet from the bathtub. Retired reporter Phil Archer, who was the first journalist on the scene, said Andrea looked like a zombie with a wildness in her eyes. Andrea was arrested and taken to the Harris County Jail. In her confession to police and later statements to jail psychiatrists, Andrea explained why she had killed her children. She said she had been thinking about killing them for 2 years. She believed she was a bad mother and that her children were not developing correctly. She said her children's manners were bad and they were not righteous. She believed that she had ruined them because of her defective mothering. She thought her son Luke would grow up to become a mute homosexual prostitute. She believed John would become a serial murderer. She foresaw that Noah would die a tragic death and that Paul would be hit by a truck. She was convinced that all of her children would be punished and go to hell because of her failures as a mother. Andrea told Dr. Melissa Ferguson, the medical director of psychiatric services at the Harris County Jail, that she needed to save her children from eternal damnation. She said, "It was the 7th deadly sin. My children weren't righteous. They stumbled because I was evil." She was focused on a Bible verse from Luke 17:2 that says it would be better for a millstone to be hung around someone's neck and for them to be thrown into the sea than for them to cause a child to stumble. Andrea believed that by killing her children while they were still young and innocent, she could save their souls from hell. She also believed that when the state of Texas executed her for the murders, Satan himself would be destroyed. Andrea was charged with capital murder, which meant she could face the death penalty. Her trial began in 2002. Her defense attorneys, George Parnham and Wendell Odom, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. 3 psychiatrists testified for the defense that Andrea was severely psychotic at the time of the murders and met the legal definition of insanity. Dr. Philip Resnick, a leading expert on filicide, testified that although Andrea knew drowning her children was legally wrong, her reasoning was psychotic because she believed she was saving them from eternal damnation. The prosecution brought in Dr. Park Dietz, a famous forensic psychiatrist who had helped convict serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dr. Dietz testified that although Andrea was mentally ill, she knew killing her children was wrong and was legally sane when she did it. During his testimony, Dr. Dietz made a critical error. He testified that Andrea had watched an episode of the television show Law and Order, in which a mother drowned her children and was acquitted because she had postpartum depression. This testimony suggested that Andrea might have gotten the idea to use an insanity defense from a TV show. The problem was that no such episode of Law and Order ever existed. Dr. Dietz had made up this information. On the 12th of March 2002, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. However, the jury refused to impose the death penalty. On the 15th of March 2002, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Many people believed the verdict was unjust, given Andrea's obvious severe mental illness. The case sparked a national conversation about postpartum depression and psychosis, and about how the justice system handles mentally ill defendants. In 2002, the Yates Children Memorial Fund was established in honor of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, to raise awareness about postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. In October 2003, Andrea was placed on suicide watch in prison after she refused to eat. She was hospitalized again in July 2004 for the same reason. On the 30th of July 2004, Rusty Yates filed for divorce from Andrea. Their divorce was finalized on the 17th of March 2005. On the 30th of April 2004, Andrea's attorney George Parnham filed an appeal of her conviction. On the 6th of January 2005, the Texas First Court of Appeals reversed Andrea's capital murder conviction. The appeals court ruled that the erroneous testimony by Dr. Marc Dutroux about the Law and Order episode had prejudiced the jury, and she deserved a new trial. Andrea was granted a second trial. The second trial began in 2006. This time, the jury heard testimony about Andrea's extensive history of mental illness, the medications she had been taking, and the religious teachings that had influenced her delusional thinking. Defense psychiatrists explained that Andrea was suffering from postpartum psychosis, a rare but extremely serious mental illness that can cause hallucinations, delusions, and a complete break from reality. They testified that her delusions about saving her children from hell were built around the teachings from Michael Woronietzky's newsletter, The Perilous Times. On the 26th of July 2006, the jury in Andrea's second trial found her not guilty by reason of insanity. This meant she would not go to prison, but would instead be committed to a state mental hospital for treatment. The verdict was unanimous. Andrea was committed to the North Texas State Hospital Vernon campus, a high-security mental health facility. In January 2007, she was transferred to Kerrville State Hospital in Kerrville, Texas, where she has remained ever since. At Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea lives a quiet and solitary life. The facility does not have razor wire, bars, armed guards, or fences like a prison. Andrea spends her days making crafts, which are sold anonymously, with the proceeds going to charity. She also watches videos of her children from before the murders. Her attorney George Parnham has remained in contact with her and speaks with her about once a week. He says there is not a day that goes by where Andrea does not think about her children, care for them, talk about them, remember the happy times before the 20th of June 2001, and grieve for them. Andrea is offered an annual hearing to determine if she is eligible to be released from the hospital, but she has declined her right to be reviewed each year. She has never sought to be released. She rarely receives visitors and never leaves the hospital grounds. According to Parnham, Andrea is doing remarkably well, considering the circumstances, though she lives with the knowledge and guilt of what she did to her children every single day. Rusty Yates has remained supportive of Andrea in the years since the murders, though they are divorced. He has always blamed her actions on severe mental illness and has criticized the doctors who failed to properly treat her condition. On the 18th of March 2006, while Andrea's second trial was underway, Rusty remarried a woman named Laura Arnold at the Clear Lake Church of Christ. He later had a son with Laura. That marriage ended in divorce in 2015. The case of Andrea Yates remains one of the most tragic and disturbing cases of filicide in American history. It exposed serious problems in the mental health care system, including insurance restrictions that force hospitals to discharge severely ill patients before they are ready. It highlighted the dangers of postpartum psychosis, a condition that affects about 1 or 2 women out of every 1,000 who give birth. It raised questions about religious extremism and the pressure placed on women to fulfill traditional gender roles, even when doing so threatens their mental and physical health. The 5 Yates children never had a chance to grow up. They were murdered by the one person who should have protected them above all others, but that person was so severely mentally ill that she believed killing them was the only way to save their souls. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Janine Jones' Infant Murders by a Pediatric Nurse, USA, 1,980 seconds. Janine Jones' Infant Murders by a Pediatric Nurse, USA, 1,980 seconds. Janine Ann Jones was born on the 13th of July, 1950, in Texas. She was given up for adoption immediately after birth and was adopted by Dick and Gladys Jones, a couple from San Antonio who had already adopted 3 other children. 2 of these children were older than Janine, and 1 was younger. The Jones family lived in a large 2-story, 4-bedroom house just outside San Antonio. They appeared to be wealthy and lived much better than most families in the surrounding area. Their home had swimming pools, huge gardens, and tennis courts. Dick Jones was a professional gambler and an entrepreneur who worked in the entertainment business. He opened a nightclub where Gladys provided the music. Dick was known as a larger-than-life personality who spent money freely and was generous to others. However, his free-spending ways and various business ventures eventually caused problems for the family. The nightclub failed, and he lost a lot of money. He then tried opening a restaurant, but that also failed. Later, he took over a billboard business, managing billboards around the city. Janine enjoyed going with her father on these trips to put up billboards, and she later said these were some of the happiest times of her childhood. Despite living in a nice house with adoptive parents, Janine felt left out and unloved throughout her childhood. She believed her parents favored the other children over her and called herself the family's black sheep. She constantly sought attention from others and would sometimes pretend to be sick to get people to notice her. At school, she was known for being bossy and controlling. She was short and overweight, which added to her feelings of loneliness. Her classmates said she was aggressive and that she would lie and manipulate people to get what she wanted. She had a reputation for betraying friends. Janine was closest to her younger brother, Travis, who was 2 years younger than her. When Janine was 10 years old, her father was arrested for breaking into a man's house and stealing a safe that contained $1,500 in cash and valuable jewelry. This brought shame to the family. When Janine was 16 years old, a terrible tragedy struck. Travis was playing with what he thought was a handmade decorative bomb that the family kept in the house. The device exploded in his hands, killing him instantly. Janine screamed and cried for hours during the funeral and even fainted from grief. Just 1 year later, when Janine was 17, her father became sick with terminal cancer. He refused treatment and decided to die at home. He made it through Christmas of 1967, but died shortly afterward at the age of 56. Janine was devastated by losing both her brother and her father in such a short time. She wanted to get married immediately after her father died because she was seeking security and comfort, but her mother Gladys refused to give permission. Gladys began drinking heavily after her husband's death. Janine and her mother fought constantly about the marriage. When Janine graduated from John Marshall High School, she married James Jimmy Harvey Delaney Jr., a high school dropout. According to some accounts, Janine trapped him into marriage by lying and telling him she was pregnant. After they were married, she admitted she was not actually pregnant. 7 months after the wedding, Jimmy joined the Navy and went away. While he was gone, Janine had multiple affairs with other men and even bragged about these relationships to people she knew. Janine's mother urged her to consider a career, so she trained to be a beautician at Mims Beauty School. When Jimmy returned from the Navy, Janine became pregnant with their first child. She gave birth to a son named Richard Michael Delaney. Despite wanting children all her life, Janine left her son in the care of her mother Gladys most of the time. Janine and Jimmy divorced on the 3rd of June 1974, after 4 years of marriage. 3 years later, they reconciled briefly, and Janine became pregnant again. On the 17th of July 1977, she gave birth to her second child, a daughter named Heather. However, Janine and Jimmy soon separated again for good. Though Janine said she loved children, she left both of her kids with her mother while she pursued her career. Janine had been working as a beautician in a hospital beauty salon, which gave her exposure to doctors and the medical world. She became extremely attracted to doctors and saw them as mysterious and powerful figures. She decided she wanted to be closer to them, so she trained for a year to become a licensed vocational nurse, also known as an LVN. This is a type of nurse with basic training, not as much education as a registered nurse. She graduated from the San Antonio Independent School District's School of Vocational Nursing in the late 1972. Janine's first nursing job was at Methodist Hospital in San Antonio in September 1977. She was fired after only 8 months because she tried to make medical decisions she was not authorized to make and because she was rude to a patient. After another short-lived job, she was hired on the 30th of October 1978 to work in the intensive care unit of the pediatric ward at Bexar County Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio. This hospital is now called University Hospital. The Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, or ICU, is where the sickest children are treated when they need constant monitoring and life-saving care. From the beginning, Janine was not a disciplined worker. She would stay on duty for more hours than required, often refusing to leave at the end of her shift. She disobeyed orders from doctors and did what she thought was best for children instead of following instructions. She skipped mandatory training classes. She made at least 8 errors in nursing care, including giving children the wrong medicines. Despite these problems, she was passionate about nursing, and some doctors liked her dedication. In early 1981, something very strange began happening in the pediatric ICU at Bexar County Hospital. Children started dying at an alarming rate during certain shifts. A statistically impossible number of babies and young children began experiencing sudden cardiac arrests and unexplained medical emergencies. These emergencies almost always happened when Janine Jones was on duty. When she worked the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, it became known among the staff as the death shift because so many children died during those hours. Medical professionals noticed that when Janine was on duty, children were 25 times more likely to suffer cardiac arrest and 10 times more likely to die compared to when she was not working. In a report published later in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1985, researchers found that 34 babies died while Jones was on duty, which increased the hospital's infant death rate by 178% during that time period. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Babies and children who were sick but stable would suddenly stop breathing or have seizures when they were under Janine's care. Sometimes she would then try to save them and succeed, appearing to be a hero. Other times, the children died despite efforts to save them. Doctors and administrators at the hospital began to suspect that something was very wrong. They started an internal investigation in 1981. Investigators suspected Janine in at least 10 deaths at the hospital, though the real number may have been much higher. One surgeon who presided over the internal investigation later explained why the hospital was reluctant to alert police. He said that the children were already so sick when they came to the pediatric ICU that it was hard to prove someone had deliberately killed them. He said, "If they're sick enough to be in the pediatric ICU, they're sick enough to die." The hospital administration faced a terrible dilemma. They suspected a nurse was murdering children, but they were afraid of being sued if they accused her and could not prove it. They also feared the publicity and scandal that would result if word got out that a serial killer had been working in their hospital for over a year. Instead of confronting the problem directly, calling the police, or firing Janine Jones specifically, the hospital administrators came up with a plan. In March 1982, they decided to upgrade the pediatric ICU by staffing it only with registered nurses instead of licensed vocational nurses. This meant that Janine Jones and all the other LVNs who worked in the pediatric ICU would have to leave that unit. The other LVNs were offered positions in different parts of the hospital. Janine was given a good recommendation and was offered a job on the pediatric floor, but she refused. On the 17th of March 1982, Janine Jones quit working at Bexar County Hospital. The suspicious deaths and unexplained medical emergencies in the pediatric ICU stopped immediately after she left. Dr. Kathleen Holland was a young pediatrician who had completed her medical residency at Bexar County Hospital. She had worked with Janine Jones there and had been impressed by her passion and dedication to sick children. Dr. Holland decided to open her own private pediatric practice in Kerrville, Texas, a small town about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. When she was hiring staff for her new clinic, she offered Janine Jones a job as the office nurse. Some of Dr. Holland's friends warned her that there were rumors and suspicions about Janine at the hospital, but Dr. Holland defended Janine and said she had worked with her and trusted her. Janine Jones began working at Dr. Holland's clinic in Kerrville on the 23rd of August 1982. The clinic had just opened, and it was located in a small town that was mostly populated by retired people. There were not many pediatricians in the area, so parents were excited to have a neighborhood doctor for their children. Almost immediately, strange things began to happen. During the 5 weeks that Janine worked at the clinic, Every child under the age of 2 who required an injection or an intravenous line experienced a sudden, unexplained medical emergency. Several children would arrive at the clinic healthy for routine checkups and then suddenly stop breathing or have seizures after being alone with Janine Jones. On the 24th of August 1982, just the second day the clinic was open, a woman named Petty McClellan brought her 5-month-old daughter, Chelsea, to the office. Chelsea McClellan was a beautiful little girl with blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She had been born premature with underdeveloped lungs, so her mother was very careful about her health. Chelsea's older brother, Cameron, had the flu, and Petty wanted Dr. Holland to check him. She brought Chelsea along to the appointment. According to Petty, Janine Jones took Chelsea into an examination room. Shortly after, the baby began having what appeared to be a seizure. She stopped breathing and had to be rushed to Sid Peterson Hospital in Kerrville. Chelsea was hospitalized for 5 days, but doctors could not find any reason why she had stopped breathing. Chelsea recovered and was sent home. However, Petty noticed something strange. During Chelsea's hospital stay, whenever Janine Jones walked into the room with Dr. Holland during rounds, Chelsea would start crying and screaming. The baby seemed terrified of Janine Jones specifically, even though she did not react the same way to other nurses. On Friday, the 17th of September 1982, Petty McClellan took Cameron back to Dr. Holland's clinic because he still had the flu. She brought Chelsea with her again. Dr. Holland ordered Chelsea to receive 2 routine immunization shots for childhood diseases. Petty McClellan was holding Chelsea in her arms when Janine Jones gave the first injection in Chelsea's left thigh. Immediately after the first shot, Chelsea began having trouble breathing. She started jerking around wildly, as if she was having a seizure. Petty asked Janine to stop, but Janine ignored her and gave Chelsea a second injection in her other thigh. Chelsea then stopped breathing altogether. She went limp in her mother's arms. Petty McClellan said that Janine had a wild look in her eyes, like she was on a high. Janine seemed excited and yelled that Chelsea was not breathing. She grabbed Chelsea from Petty's arms, placed her on a table, and told Petty to go get the doctor. An ambulance was called immediately. Chelsea was breathing on her own again by the time she got into the ambulance. She was taken to Sid Peterson Hospital, where doctors decided to transfer her to a larger hospital in San Antonio for careful monitoring. Somehow, Janine Jones managed to get into the ambulance with Chelsea and 2 paramedics without the parents' knowledge. The McClellan parents followed behind in their car. On the drive to San Antonio, the ambulance had to pull over in the town of Comfort. About a quarter of the way there, Dr. Holland and Janine jumped out. They told the McClellans that Chelsea was crashing. Chelsea McClellan died on the 17th of September 1982 on the way to the hospital. She was 15 months old. Her parents were devastated. Petty McClellan immediately suspected something was wrong, though she could not explain exactly what had happened. The initial cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. About a week after the funeral, Petty McClellan went to the Garden of Memories cemetery to place flowers on her daughter's grave. When she arrived, she saw Janine Jones kneeling at the foot of Chelsea's grave, sobbing and wailing the child's name over and over. She rocked back and forth in apparent anguish, as if Chelsea had been her own daughter. Petty found this behavior very strange. Meanwhile, more children were having medical emergencies at Dr. Holland's clinic. On the 24th of September 1982, Texas Rangers were finally notified for the first time about the suspicious pattern. Dr. Holland had made a disturbing discovery. She found a bottle of succinylcholine in the clinic with 2 puncture marks in the rubber top. Succinylcholine, also known by the brand name Anectine, is a powerful muscle relaxant that causes temporary paralysis of all muscles, including those that control breathing. It is used during surgery as part of general anesthesia, but it can be deadly if given improperly. Dr. Holland had never ordered this drug and had never used it. The bottle should not have been in the clinic at all. When Dr. Holland confronted Janine Jones about the punctured bottle, Janine suggested that they should just throw it away and tell people it was lost. Dr. Holland refused. Janine Jones was fired and told not to return to the clinic. Investigators began to suspect that Janine had been injecting children with succinylcholine to make them stop breathing, and then trying to revive them so she could appear to be a hero. Sometimes the children survived, and sometimes they did not. On the 12th of January 1983, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office was officially notified about the suspicions surrounding Janine Jones. Investigators decided to exhume Chelsea McClellan's body from the cemetery to test for drugs. 8 months after Chelsea died, her body was dug up and tissue samples were taken. The samples were sent to Stockholm, Sweden, where a toxicologist named Dr. Frederick Reeders performed highly sensitive tests. He found traces of succinylcholine in Chelsea's thigh muscles and organs. This proved that Chelsea had not died from SIDS or from routine immunizations. She had been deliberately injected with a deadly drug. Janine Jones was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial began in January 1984 inches, Georgetown, Texas. The trial was moved there because of all the publicity in San Antonio and Kerrville. Prosecutors presented evidence that Janine had access to succinylcholine, that she was present when Chelsea and other children had medical emergencies, and that she had punctured the bottle to draw the drug into syringes. Petty McClellan testified about watching Janine give Chelsea the injections that killed her. Dr. Holland testified about the suspicious bottle and about how Janine had suggested covering it up. On the 16th of February 1984, the jury found Janine Jones guilty of murdering Chelsea McClellan. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. In October 1984, she was tried in a second case for nearly killing a 4-week-old baby named Rolando Santos by injecting him with heparin, a blood thinner that caused him to hemorrhage. She was convicted of injury to a child and sentenced to 60 years in prison to run at the same time as her first sentence. During the investigations and trials, prosecutors and investigators suspected that Janine Jones had actually killed somewhere between 11 and 60 babies and children during her nursing career. Ron Sutton, the prosecutor who won the murder conviction, estimated the number was between 11 and 46 deaths at Bexar County Hospital alone, not counting the children in Kerrville. However, it was very difficult to prove these deaths were murders because the children were already sick when they came to the hospital. Also, hospital officials at Bexar County allegedly misplaced and then destroyed records of many of the suspicious deaths to avoid lawsuits against the hospital. Janine Jones served her prison sentence at the Lane Murray Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Over the years, she repeatedly denied killing any children. She insisted she was innocent and said that if babies died, it was because of mistakes by incompetent doctors, not because of anything she did. In the early 1992s, Petty McClellan discovered something shocking. A congressman told her that Janine Jones would not serve her full 99-year sentence because of a Texas law called mandatory supervision that was passed in 1977. Inmates with good behavior could earn time off their sentences. This law was designed to reduce prison overcrowding, and it applied to violent criminals who were sentenced under the old law. Janine Jones would be eligible for release in March 2018, after serving only about 1/3 of her sentence. Petty McClellan was devastated and angry. The families of all the suspected victims were horrified that a woman who had murdered dozens of children might walk free. Petty McClellan became determined to find a way to keep Janine Jones in prison. She worked with Houston victims advocate Andy Kahan to campaign for prosecutors to bring new murder charges against Jones for the deaths at Bexar County Hospital. However, this seemed almost impossible. More than 30 years had passed since those deaths. Key witnesses had died. Memories had faded. Hospital records had been destroyed. These were the coldest of cold cases. In November 2014, a new Bexar County District Attorney named Nico LaHood was elected. LaHood assigned a young assistant district attorney named Jason Goss to investigate the old cases. Goss was only 1 year old when Janine Jones committed her crimes, but he was determined to find justice. He began digging through dusty boxes of courthouse files from the 1982nd investigation. He searched for any evidence that could be used to prosecute Janine for the hospital deaths. On the 25th of May 2017, just months before Janine Jones was scheduled to be released. Prosecutors brought the first new murder charge against her. She was indicted for the murder of one-month-old Joshua Earl Sawyer, who died on the 12th of December 1981 at Bexar County Hospital. Joshua had been hospitalized for smoke inhalation after a house fire and was recovering when he suddenly died from an overdose of Dilantin, a seizure medication. Over the next few months, prosecutors brought 4 more murder indictments against Janine Jones for the deaths of other babies at the hospital. Richard Ricky Nelson, age 8 months, who died on the 3rd of July 1981. Rosemary Vega, age 2 years, who died on the 16th of September 1981. Paul Villarreal, age 4 months, who died on the 24th of September 1981. And Patrick Zavala, age 4 months, who died on the 17th of January 1982. Each indictment came with a $1 million bond, which meant Janine Jones had to stay in the Bexar County Jail even after her mandatory release date passed. She would remain in jail until her trials were completed. Janine pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. Her lawyers tried to get the indictments thrown out, arguing that it was unfair to charge her so many years later. The judge rejected these motions. Tragically, Petty McClellan, who had fought so hard to keep Janine Jones behind bars, died suddenly in June 2019 at the age of 64. 6 months later, Juanita Villarreal, the mother of 3-month-old Paul, who was one of the 5 babies Janine was newly charged with killing, also died. Neither woman lived to see the final resolution of the case. On the 16th of January 2020, just 1 month before her trial was scheduled to begin, Janine Jones shocked everyone by changing her plea. At 69 years old, using a walker and wearing dark glasses, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer as part of a plea deal. In exchange for her guilty plea to 1 murder, the other 4 cases were dismissed. She was sentenced to life in prison. Under the terms of the sentence, Janine Jones must serve at least 20 years before she is eligible for parole, minus the 2 years she already spent in county jail awaiting trial. This means she will not be eligible for parole until she is approximately 87 years old. At the sentencing hearing, State Judge Frank Castro told Jones, "Your life sentence doesn't come close to what you did to these families and the tragedy that you caused. You took God's little precious gift, babies, defenseless, innocent. I truly believe your ultimate judgment is in the next life." Connie Weeks, Joshua Sawyer's mother, stood just feet away from Janine Jones and told her, "I'm glad that you will never see daylight." 4 other family members of victims also gave emotional statements in court. The case of Janine Jones remains one of the most shocking and disturbing cases of serial murder in American medical history. She is suspected of killing up to 60 babies and children during her career as a nurse in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, though she was only convicted for 2 deaths until her 2020 guilty plea. Janine Jones will almost certainly die in prison, never able to harm another child again. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to John Wayne Gacy Murders of Boys and Young Men USA, 1972, 1978. John Wayne Gacy, Murders of Boys and Young Men, USA, 1972, 1978. John Wayne Gacy was born on the 17th of March 1942 at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children and the only son born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His father worked as an auto repair machinist and was a veteran of World War I. His mother was a homemaker. John had 2 sisters named Joanne, who was older, and Karen, who was younger. The family was Catholic and had Polish and Danish ancestry. John was very close to his mother and his 2 sisters, but his relationship with his father was extremely difficult and painful. John Stanley Gacy, the father, was an alcoholic who frequently came home drunk and became violent with his family. He would beat John and his sisters with a razor strap, which is a leather strap used for sharpening razor blades. He also physically abused his wife Marion. The father constantly belittled young John, calling him stupid and dumb, and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. He would tell John that he would probably grow up to be queer, and called him a mama's boy and a sissy because John was close to his mother. One of John's earliest memories was being beaten by his father at age 4 for accidentally moving some car engine parts. When John's mother tried to protect him from the abuse, this only made his father angrier and led to more accusations that John was weak and effeminate. When John was around 9 years old, he suffered a blow to the head from a swing while playing. Over the next 5 years, he experienced frequent blackouts and seizures. Doctors eventually discovered that he had a blood clot in his brain, which was removed with medication. John also had a congenital heart condition that caused him to have seizures and spend significant time in hospitals throughout his childhood. He later said that he probably spent about a year of his life in hospital beds during his youth. His father did not believe that John's health problems were real and accused him of faking his illness to get attention. The heart condition prevented John from participating in sports and athletic activities, which led to him being bullied by other children. He was overweight and struggled to fit in with his peers. Between the ages of 6 and 10, John was sexually molested by a teenage daughter of one of his mother's friends. When he was between 10 and 12 years old, a family friend who was a contractor also molested him. John did not tell anyone about either of these incidents because he was afraid, and he feared his father would not believe him and would beat him for it. His education suffered because of all the problems at home and his health issues. John attended 4 different high schools but never graduated. In his senior year, he dropped out of high school and left home. In 1962, when John was about 20 years old, he moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. He found work as a mortuary attendant. One day, while working at the mortuary, something very disturbing happened. John climbed into a coffin with a dead teenage boy and hugged and caressed the corpse. He was shocked and frightened by his own behavior. Confused and terrified by what he had done, he returned home to Chicago to live with his parents again. After returning, he enrolled at Northwestern Business College and graduated in 1963. He discovered that he had natural talent for salesmanship and marketing. John found work as a management trainee at the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. He was successful in this job and was soon promoted to manager of his department. While working there, he met a co-worker named Marlon Myers, and they began dating. In 1964, John and Marlon got married. Marlon's father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, and John moved there with his wife to work as a manager for his father-in-law's business. The couple had 2 children together, a son named Michael and a daughter named Christine. John became very active in the community in Waterloo. He joined the United States Junior Chamber, which was known as the JCs. This was a civic organization for young men focused on developing leadership skills and community service. John became a tireless worker for the JCs and was well respected in the organization. He threw parties and social gatherings and seemed to be a successful businessman and family man. However, beneath this respectable surface, John was leading a dark double life. In August 1967, John sexually assaulted a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees, who was the son of a fellow JC's member. John had lured the teenager to his house with the promise of showing him pornographic films. The boy told his father about the assault, and his father went to the police. John was arrested and denied all the charges. He even offered to take a lie detector test. However, John then did something that made his situation much worse. He hired one of his young employees, an 18-year-old named Russell Schroeder, to physically assault Donald Voorhees to intimidate him and prevent him from testifying at trial. After being attacked and threatened, Donald reported this to the police as well. John was evaluated by medical authorities who diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic tendencies. The doctors said that no treatment would help him and that he would certainly commit more offenses in the future. However, they also declared him mentally fit to stand trial. On the 10th of May, 1968, John was indicted on sodomy charges. On the 3rd of December 1968, he was tried and convicted. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Anamosa State Penitentiary in Iowa. His wife Marlin was devastated by learning about his crimes and filed for divorce. She was granted full custody of their 2 children. John was a model prisoner while incarcerated. He earned his high school diploma in prison and became involved in various prison activities. He was so well behaved that he was released on parole on the 18th of June, 1970, after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. After his release, John moved back to Chicago to start his life over. His parole ended on the 18th of October, 1971. His mother helped him buy a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, which was just outside of Chicago. On the 12th of February 1971, while still on parole, John was charged again with sexually assaulting a teenage boy. However, the witness did not appear in court, and the charges were dropped. John quickly became very popular with his neighbors in Norwood Park. He threw large annual summer parties that were hugely popular in the neighborhood. He joined the local Democratic Party organization and became a Democratic precinct captain. He was photographed with important political figures, including First Lady Rosalind Carter, the wife of President Jimmy Carter, in 1978. In 1972, John married a woman named Carol Hoff, who was a divorcee and former high school classmate. She had 2 daughters from her previous marriage. That same year, John committed his first known murder. On the 3rd of January 1972, John drove to the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown Chicago in the early morning hours. There, he met a 16-year-old boy named Timothy Jack McCoy, who was traveling from Michigan back to his home in Nebraska and had a 13-hour layover in Chicago, waiting for his connecting bus. John approached Timothy and offered to show him the sights of Chicago and give him a place to stay for a few hours. Timothy agreed and went with John to his house. According to John's later account, the 2 drank alcohol and engaged in sexual activity. John claimed that the next morning, he woke up around 4 in the morning and saw Timothy standing in his bedroom doorway holding a butcher knife. John said he rushed at Timothy, and they struggled for the knife. During the fight, Timothy fell on the knife and was stabbed in the chest repeatedly, dying from his wounds. However, John then claimed he realized that Timothy had not been threatening him at all. He said Timothy had actually been making them breakfast and had simply been holding the knife while coming to wake John up. John later admitted that this version of events was likely a lie and that he had deliberately killed Timothy. He buried Timothy's body in the crawl space beneath his house and later covered the grave with a 4-inch layer of concrete. In an interview years later, John described the sexual pleasure he felt while stabbing Timothy to death. He said that, as he stabbed the boy and listened to him choking and gasping for air, he experienced an intense orgasm. He stated that this is when he realized that killing was the ultimate thrill for him. John later said he committed his second murder around January 1974. This victim was never identified. He strangled this person and placed the body in his closet before burying it. Between 1972 and 1975, John killed at least 3 young men. In 1974, John founded a construction contracting company called PDM Contractors, which stood for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. The business became quite successful. John hired many teenage boys and young men to work for his company. His wife Carol began to notice strange things. She found gay, pornographic magazines in the house featuring young men and boys. She became suspicious of John's frequent nights away from home and his close relationships with young male employees. She complained to John about a terrible smell coming from the crawl space beneath the house. John told her the smell was from a broken sewer pipe or dead mice, and he spread lime in the crawl space to try to cover up the odor. On the 2nd of March 1976, John and Carol were divorced. After his divorce, John's killing dramatically increased because he now had the house completely to himself. Between 1976 and 1978, he murdered at least 30 more young men and boys. His victims ranged in age from 14 to 21 years old, though most were teenagers. John developed a clear pattern for his murders. He would cruise around Chicago looking for victims. Many of his victims were runaways, male prostitutes, or young men who worked for his construction company. He would approach them and offer them work, money, alcohol, drugs, or a place to stay. Once John got his victims to his house, he would give them alcohol or drugs to lower their resistance. At some point, he would mention a magic trick he wanted to show them. The trick involved handcuffs. John would convince the victim to put on the handcuffs, claiming it was part of the magic trick. Once the victim was handcuffed, John would reveal that the trick was that the victim was not getting out. He would then rape and torture his victim. John's preferred method of killing was what he called the rope trick. He would tie a rope or a board with a rope attached around the victim's neck like a tourniquet. He would then twist it tighter and tighter, slowly strangling the victim to death over a period that could last an hour or even 2 hours. Sometimes he would also stuff cloth deep into the victim's throat to cause them to suffocate. He would often sit on top of his victims while they died and force them to perform oral sex on him. Sometimes he would partially drown victims in his bathtub and then revive them before finally killing them. After killing his victims, John would typically keep their corpses under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space under his house. He would periodically pour quicklime over the bodies to speed up decomposition. Some victims were taken to his garage, where he would embalm them before burial. Eventually, the crawl space became so full of bodies that there was no more room. When this happened, John began disposing of bodies by throwing them from a bridge into the Des Plaines River. He would drive south on Interstate 55 and throw the bodies off the bridge over the river. On the 31st of July, 1975, John killed an 18-year-old named John Butkovich, who had worked for PDM contractors for 8 months. John Butkovich disappeared after going to John's house to demand his final paycheck. His parents reported him missing. In 1976, John killed several young men, including 16-year-old Michael Bonin, 16-year-old William Carroll, 16-year-old James Hackinson, 17-year-old Rick Johnston, 21-year-old Francis Alexander, and 17-year-old Gregory Godzik. Gregory had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks and had told his family that John had him dig trenches in the crawl space for drainage tiles. After Gregory went missing, his parents and sister contacted John. John claimed that Gregory had told him he wanted to run away from home. John also said he had received an answering machine message from Gregory after he disappeared. By the end of 1977, John had killed 6 more victims. In 1978, he killed several more. One victim who survived was a 19-year-old named Robert Donnelly. John abducted Robert at gunpoint from a Chicago bus stop and took him to his house, where he raped and tortured him repeatedly over several hours before dumping him in Lincoln Park. Robert survived and reported the attack to police, but they did not pursue charges against John. Another survivor was a 26-year-old man named Jeffrey Rignall. In March 1978, John lured Jeffrey into his car with an offer to smoke marijuana together. John then used a chloroform-soaked rag to knock Jeffrey unconscious. He took Jeffrey to his house, where he raped and tortured him for several hours before dumping him in Lincoln Park. Jeffrey survived and went to the police, but again, no charges were filed against John at that time. On the evening of the 11th of December, 1978, John went to the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling contract with the store owner, Phil Torf. While he was there, a 15-year-old part-time employee named Robert Piest overheard John mention that his company often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, which was almost double what Robert earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after John left the store, Robert's mother Elizabeth arrived to pick up her son so they could celebrate her birthday together at home. Robert asked his mother to wait, telling her that some contractor wanted to talk to him about a job and that he would be right back. Robert left the store at 9 o'clock in the evening, promising to return shortly. He never came back. Robert's mother and his co-worker, Kim Byers, went looking for him after about 10 minutes when he did not return. They found only footprints in the snow and tire tracks from a vehicle. At 11:29 that night, Robert's parents went to the Des Plaines police station and filed a missing person report. The case was assigned to Lieutenant Joseph Kozenjak. whose own son attended the same high school as Robert. Lieutenant Kozenjak took the case very seriously and began an investigation immediately. The pharmacy owner Phil Torf told police that John Wayne Gacy was the contractor who had been at the store that evening. On December 12, police contacted John and asked him to come to the station for questioning. John called Lieutenant Kozenjak at 11 o'clock that night and asked if he still wanted to talk. When told yes, John asked how long it would take, then said he would be there. Lieutenant Kozenjak waited until 1 o'clock in the morning, but John never showed up. Police later learned that after that phone call, John went to his attic, retrieved Robert's body, put it in the trunk of his car, and drove south of Joliet, where he threw the body into the Des Plaines River from the Interstate 55 bridge. At 3:20 in the morning, John walked into the Des Plaines police station with mud on his pants and shoes. He gave police a brief statement. Lieutenant Kozenjak ran a background check on John and was shocked to discover that he had been convicted in Iowa in 1968 for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. With this information, police obtained a search warrant for John's house. On December 13, police searched the house. They found suspicious items, including a receipt for photo film from the Nissan pharmacy that belonged to Kim Byers, Robert's co-worker who had loaned Robert her jacket. They also found a high school class ring that was later linked to John Sick, a young man who had been missing for 2 years. They found books on homosexuality, several driver's licenses and identification cards belonging to other people, handcuffs, a 2x4 piece of wood with holes drilled at each end, pieces of clothing, syringes, and various drugs. Police began 24-hour surveillance of John. On December 15, a police employee told investigators that 2 former PDM employees had disappeared. On December 19, John invited 2 surveillance officers into his house for breakfast. While one of the officers was using the bathroom, the furnace turned on, and a terrible smell came through the heating vent. The officer immediately recognized it as the smell of decomposing bodies. He described it as smelling like a morgue. On December 20, John met with his lawyer Sam Amirante to discuss a civil lawsuit John wanted to file against the police for harassing him with their surveillance. During this meeting, John confessed to his lawyer that he had killed at least 30 people. The lawyer was horrified. On the 21st of December 1978, while under police surveillance, John was seen giving a package containing marijuana to a gas station attendant. Police followed him and arrested him on charges of possession and distribution of cannabis. While John was in custody, police obtained a second search warrant. This time, they entered the crawl space. Within minutes of entering, the evidence technician discovered human bones and decomposing body parts. Over the following weeks, police excavated John's property. They found the remains of 29 boys and young men buried on the property. 26 bodies were found in the crawl space. 2 were buried elsewhere on the property under the garage, and 1 was buried under the concrete patio. 4 more bodies, including Robert Piest's, were later recovered from the Des Plaines River. On the 22nd of December 1978, John gave a formal confession to police. He described in detail how he had killed his victims. He drew a map showing where the bodies were buried in the crawl space. John was charged with 33 murders. His trial began on the 6th of February 1980 in Cook County, Illinois. The trial lasted for several weeks and received enormous media attention. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence against John, including his detailed confessions, the physical evidence recovered from his property, and testimony from survivors. Family members of the identified victims testified, and several had to be helped from the courtroom because they were so overcome with grief. John's defense attorneys argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. They called several psychologists who testified that John was schizophrenic and could not control his behavior. The defense even called Jeffrey Rignall, the man who had survived John's torture in 1978, hoping he would testify that John seemed insane. However, Jeffrey's testimony backfired. He was so traumatized by recounting his ordeal that he vomited while on the witness stand, which only reinforced for the jury how horrible John's crimes were. On the 12th of March 1980, after deliberating for 1 hour and 50 minutes, the jury found John guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child in reference to Robert Piest. This made John the person convicted of more murders than anyone else in United States history at that time. On the 13th of March 1980, after deliberating for 2 hours and 15 minutes, the jury sentenced John to death. Under Illinois law at the time, the death penalty could only be applied to murders that occurred after June 1977, when the state had reinstated capital punishment. Therefore, John received the death sentence for 12 of the murders and was sentenced to natural life in prison for the remaining 21 murders. John was transferred to Menard Correctional Center to begin serving his sentence on death row. While in prison, John spent 14 years filing numerous appeals. All of his appeals were denied. He claimed that some of the murders had been committed by employees who had keys to his house while he was away on business trips, but this claim was not believed. In prison, John took up painting and became a prolific artist. Many of his paintings were of clowns, and these paintings later sold for thousands of dollars as what is called murderabilia, which are items connected to killers. He also gave interviews and often changed his story, sometimes denying his guilt entirely, and other times confessing to even more murders than he had been convicted of. On the 9th of May 1994, John was transferred from Menard Correctional Center to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, in preparation for his execution. For his last meal, John requested 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken original recipe, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. Prison officials described his demeanor before the execution as chatty and talkative. Shortly after midnight on the 10th of May 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. The execution did not go smoothly. There was a chemical clog in the tubing that delayed the procedure. It took 18 minutes for John to die, which was about 4 times longer than a typical lethal injection execution. John was 52 years old at the time of his death. When asked if he had any last words, John's final statement was defiant and unrepentant. Prison officials reported that he said taking his life would not compensate for the loss of the others, and that the state was murdering him. However, other witnesses reported that his actual final words were simply 2 words: "Kiss my ass." John was pronounced dead at 12:58 inches the morning. Nearly 1,000 people gathered outside the prison to witness the end of one of America's most notorious serial killers. About 24 family members of John's victims were barred from the actual execution chamber as a security precaution, but they were allowed to keep vigil in an administration building until they received word that the execution had been carried out. William Kunkel, the prosecutor who had convicted John, witnessed the execution and said afterward that John got a much easier death than any of his victims. The Will County coroner who performed the autopsy stated that, to the best of his knowledge, John did not suffer any pain during the execution. Of the 33 victims, 28 have been positively identified. However, 5 victims remain unidentified to this day and are buried in various Chicago area cemeteries. Each of their gravestones is inscribed with the words, "We remembered." Over the years since John's arrest, intensive efforts have been made to identify these remaining victims using dental records, DNA testing, and other forensic techniques. Some victims were identified decades after the original investigation. Timothy McCoy, John's first victim, was not identified until May 1986, more than 7 years after John's arrest. Francis Alexander was identified as body 5 inches, June 2011, more than 30 years after his death. James Hawkinson was identified as body 24 inches, August 2017, nearly 40 years after his murder. William Bundy was identified as body 19 inches, October 2021, over 40 years after he was killed. The John Wayne Gacy case shocked the nation and the world. It exposed serious failures in the criminal justice system and in police procedures. Multiple young men had reported being assaulted by John to police over the years, but their complaints were not properly investigated. There was significant bias against the victims because many of them were gay or bisexual, or were runaways and male prostitutes. At the time, homosexuality was heavily stigmatized, and police did not take complaints from young gay men seriously. It was only in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association had removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. Many investigators believe that if police had properly investigated the earlier complaints against John, many lives could have been saved. The case also led to important changes in how police handle missing person cases. After John's arrest, the Chicago Police Department computerized data associated with missing persons so that patterns among cases could be identified across different police districts. This helped prevent similar cases from going undetected in the future. The case remains one of the most studied examples of serial murder in criminal psychology and forensic science. John Wayne Gacy's ability to maintain a respectable public image while committing horrific crimes demonstrated how serial killers can hide in plain sight within their communities. His case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, television series, and films, and continues to fascinate and horrify people decades after his crimes were discovered. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.